I am Alia, 28 years old, and on the day I earned my Master of Business Administration, I stood entirely alone on the university lawn. While other graduates hugged their parents and posed for photos with massive bouquets of flowers, my phone buzzed with a single message from my father. Do not expect anyone to show up or hand you a handout. Jasmine and Bradley just closed their seed round. We are celebrating at the Oakmont Country Club. Uber home and pack your trash out of your apartment. I simply smiled, tossed my graduation gown into the nearest trash bin, and stepped into my custom-armored Maybach. My family thought I was a failure begging for scraps. They had no idea I was already a billionaire tech CEO, and their entire world was about to be funded by my charity. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever proven your toxic family wrong. The Atlanta sun was beating down relentlessly on the campus courtyard, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured grass. Around me, the air vibrated with the sounds of celebration. Proud Black families were cheering, fathers were lifting their daughters off the ground, and mothers were wiping away joyful tears. I stood completely still in the center of the chaos, reading the text message from my father Marcus for the third time. The words were harsh, but they lacked the power to hurt me anymore. There was a time when a message like that would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt and tears. There was a time when I would have begged for their attention, wondering what I had to do to earn a fraction of the love they showered on my older sister Jasmine. But that version of Aaliyah had died a long time ago, starved of affection and buried under years of their emotional abuse. I looked down at the heavy fabric of my graduation gown. It felt suffocating not because of the summer heat, but because it represented an educational milestone my family deemed entirely worthless. Without a second thought, I unzipped the gown, pulled it off my shoulders, and dropped it directly into a nearby campus trash can. I tossed the velvet cap right on top of it. I smoothed down the sleek lines of my tailored white suit, adjusted my watch, and walked away from the celebration without looking back. I bypassed the crowded visitor parking lots and walked straight to the private access road. A gleaming black Maybach was idling at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the bright sky. As I approached, my security detail immediately stepped out, opening the heavy armored door for me. I slid into the cool leather-lined interior of the back seat, letting the profound silence of the soundproof cabin wash over me. My driver looked at me through the rearview mirror. Congratulations on your graduation, Miss Pierce. Shall I take you to Nexus AI headquarters? I leaned back against the plush headrest and shook my head. No, take me to Oakmont. It is time to pay the bill. The drive through the city was smooth and silent. I watched the neighborhoods of Atlanta roll by my mind, tracing the long, painful history of my family. My parents, Marcus and Vivian Pierce, were obsessed with the illusion of wealth. They desperately clung to their status within the Black elite of the city, prioritizing country club memberships and social appearances over genuine stability. Marcus ran a wealth management firm that was perpetually teetering on the edge of ruin, while Vivian spent her days orchestrating charity galas to maintain her position in her exclusive social circles. Jasmine, my older sister, was their golden child. She was the perfect accessory to their curated lives, holding a figurehead position as vice president at our father's firm. And then there was Bradley, Jasmine's white husband. He was a tech bro with an inflated ego and a talent for taking credit for other people's work. My family treated him like royalty, convinced that his connections would finally elevate them to the upper echelons of wealth they so desperately craved. Oakmont Country Club was a fortress of exclusivity, a place where generations of wealthy families gathered to display their status. My parents spent an exorbitant amount of money to maintain their membership there, viewing it as the ultimate symbol of their arrival. As the Maybach glided past the pristine golf courses and pulled up to the Grand Valet entrance, I felt a familiar sense of disgust. The valet rushed forward to open my door, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of my vehicle. I stepped out, ignoring the curious stares of the club members on the veranda, and walked through the heavy mahogany doors. The dining room was opulent, filled with crystal chandeliers and tables draped in heavy white linen. It did not take me long to spot them. Marcus, Vivian, Jasmine, and Bradley were seated at a prime table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. They were laughing loudly, commanding the attention of the room. Empty plates of expensive seafood sat in front of them, alongside 3 empty bottles of vintage champagne. I approached, slowly stopping just behind a large floral arrangement to observe. A waiter in a crisp white jacket approached their table carrying a silver tray with a leather billfold. He placed it discreetly next to my father. I watched Marcus pick it up with a theatrical flourish, not even glancing at the total, before pulling a shiny platinum credit card from his wallet and dropping it onto the tray. "Keep the change," my father said loudly, ensuring the neighboring tables could hear his generosity. The waiter offered a tight, polite smile and walked away. I remained in the shadows waiting. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Less than 2 minutes later, the waiter returned, his posture rigid with discomfort. He leaned down and whispered something quietly into my father's ear. Marcus's face instantly hardened. "What do you mean it declined?" He snapped, his voice carrying across the quiet dining room. "Run it again. Your machine must be broken." The waiter maintained his professional composure, though his face flushed. "Sir, I have tried it twice. The bank has explicitly declined the transaction. The bill is $12,000. Do you have another form of payment?" Panic flashed across Vivian's face. She darted her eyes nervously toward a nearby table where several prominent members of her social club were seated, clearly listening to the commotion. "Marcus, do something," she hissed through gritted teeth. "We are making a scene." Bradley leaned back in his chair, puffing out his chest with an air of absolute superiority. He offered my father a patronizing smile. "Relax, Marcus. I have got this covered. The tech industry pays well, remember." Bradley pulled out a sleek corporate credit card and tossed it onto the tray. "Put it on my company account. Let us celebrate properly." The waiter nodded, relieved by the apparent solution, and hurried away. Bradley turned to Jasmine, kissing her cheek while she beamed at him with adoration. My parents showered him with gratitude, completely ignoring the sheer embarrassment of their own financial failure. But their relief was short-lived. The waiter returned moments later, looking even more distressed than before. He placed the tray back on the table with trembling hands. "Sir, I am incredibly sorry," the waiter said, addressing Bradley. "This card has also been declined." Bradley shot out of his chair, his face turning an angry shade of red. "That is impossible. I just closed a major funding round. Your system is a joke. Bring your manager out here right now." Vivian began, hyperventilating, pressing a napkin to her chest, as the whispers from the neighboring tables grew louder. Her carefully constructed social standing was evaporating in real time. Jasmine frantically dug through her designer purse, pulling out a handful of debit cards, but her hands were shaking too badly to sort through them. Marcus sat frozen, his pride shattered in the middle of his sacred sanctuary. This was the exact moment I chose to step out from behind the floral arrangement. The sharp click of my heels against the hardwood floor cut through their panicked bickering. They all turned their heads simultaneously, their expressions shifting from panic to sheer confusion as I approached their table. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a solid, borderless titanium Centurion card. I tossed it onto the silver tray. The heavy metal hit the leather with a loud, satisfying thud. "Run this," I told the waiter, my voice calm and authoritative. "Consider it a charitable donation to the less fortunate." The waiter looked at the legendary black card, his eyes wide with recognition, and practically sprinted away to process the payment. The silence at the table was absolute until Vivian finally found her voice. "Where did you steal a fake black card?" My mother sneered. Her face twisted with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "Just like you stole Bradley's app concept in college. You are trying to embarrass us on purpose." I stared at her, feeling a cold wave of clarity. This was their tactic. Whenever they were cornered, they rewrote history to make themselves the victims. Years ago, while I was coding late nights in my dorm room, Bradley had stolen the source code for an application I designed. He pitched it as his own, and when I tried to expose him, my entire family gaslit me. They called me delusional, jealous, and crazy. They threatened to cut off my tuition if I did not drop the accusations, forcing me to build my entire life from scratch while Bradley paraded around as a tech genius. Bradley let out a condescending scoff, adjusting the expensive Rolex on his wrist. "Cute trick, Aaliyah. You probably drained your savings account to buy a prepaid metal card just to show off. But let me give you some advice. Tech is for the big boys. My startup just got valued at $5 million by Vulture Capital. You are playing a dangerous game trying to look rich in front of people who actually run the world. I did not break eye contact with him. I slowly pulled my phone from my pocket and unlocked the screen. Funny you mention Vulture Capital, Bradley, I said, leaning forward and resting my hands on the table. Because Vulture Capital is a subsidiary of Nexus AI. And as the sole founder and chief executive officer of Nexus AI, I personally review all of our acquisitions. Bradley's confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he forced out a laugh. You are insane. You are a student living in a dump. You do not own a tech conglomerate. I tapped the screen of my phone exactly once. A second later, Bradley's phone erupted with a series of urgent, piercing notification sounds. He grabbed his device off the table, his eyes scanning the screen. All color drained from his face as he stared at the alerts from his banking applications. The $5 million funding drop he had been celebrating all afternoon was gone. His company accounts were showing a negative balance entirely frozen by the parent investor. What did you do? Bradley choked out, his voice cracking as he looked up at me with genuine terror. What did you just do to my company? Bradley forced out a harsh, breathless laugh, his face pale as he desperately tried to regain his composure. He quickly shoved his phone face down on the white linen tablecloth, puffing out his chest and adjusting the lapels of his expensive blazer. He looked around the dining room, ensuring the elite members of the Oakmont Country Club were still watching him play the role of the successful entrepreneur. He locked eyes with me, putting on a patronizing smile that I had seen 1,000 times before. You really think you can scare me with a glitch on a banking app? He scoffed, his voice dripping with arrogance. Alia, I know you just got your cute little Master of Business Administration degree today, but let me explain how the real world works. Venture capital firms like Vulture Capital deal with millions of dollars in seed rounds. They use highly complex, decentralized financial algorithms to secure assets. You do not just hack into a system and freeze a $5 million valuation. You clearly do not understand the back-end mechanics of corporate finance or institutional investing. Leave the tech industry to people who actually know what they are doing before you get yourself sued. Jasmine immediately jumped to her husband's defense, slamming her manicured hands onto the table. Her eyes were blazing with pure, unadulterated hatred. She glared at me, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that echoed off the crystal chandeliers above us. You are so pathetic, Jasmine sneered. You showed up here on my celebration day just to cause a scene because you are a jealous spinster. You have no man, you have no real money, and you are bitter that Bradley is building an empire while you have absolutely nothing. You have always been obsessed with competing with me, but faking a cyber attack to ruin my husband is a new low even for you. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply looked at my sister and her arrogant husband with complete, absolute pity. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and slowly pulled out my phone. I do not need to hack into any system. Bradley, I said, my voice carrying a quiet authority that made the neighboring tables fall completely silent. Because Vulture Capital is a wholly owned subsidiary of Nexus AI, and as the sole founder, majority shareholder, and chief executive officer of Nexus AI, I personally review every single acquisition my firm makes. I tapped the screen of my phone exactly one time. The reaction was instantaneous. Bradley's phone, still lying face down on the table, began to vibrate violently. A symphony of automated alerts pierced the quiet dining room. He snatched the device, his eyes darting frantically across the screen. I watched the blood drain entirely from his face. The $5 million seed round was not just paused. The funds had been actively revoked. His commercial accounts displayed massive red banners indicating a total lockdown by the parent investor. This is illegal! Bradley shouted, his voice cracking in absolute panic. He leaped out of his chair, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. You cannot do this. This is a violation of fiduciary duty. This is corporate espionage and unauthorized mainframe infiltration. I will have you arrested for federal cyber terrorism. You are breaching decentralized ledgers and manipulating secure servers. I will destroy you in court. I let out a soft, genuine laugh at his desperate string of meaningless buzzwords. You cannot even string together a coherent technical sentence, Bradley. You used a drag-and-drop website builder to create a shiny interface, but the core algorithm your entire startup relies on is my proprietary code. You stole it from my dorm room 4 years ago, slapped your name on it, and thought you could outsmart the person who actually wrote it. I did not hack you. I simply revoked your license to use my intellectual property, which immediately triggered a breach of contract with Vulture Capital. Your company is worth exactly $0. Jasmine completely lost her mind. The realization that her lavish lifestyle and fake rich status were evaporating in real time pushed her over the edge. She let out a guttural scream, lunging across the table with her arm raised high, aiming a vicious slap directly at my face. She knocked over a crystal water glass, sending ice and water spilling across my mother's designer dress. She never made contact. I caught her wrist in midair, my grip tightening around her forearm with absolute effortless precision. Jasmine gasped in shock, her eyes widening as I twisted her wrist just enough to send a sharp jolt of pain up her arm, forcing her to freeze in place. I held her there, looking directly into her eyes, letting her feel the undeniable physical and absolute financial power I now held over her. "Do not ever try to put your hands on me again," I warned her, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You are not the golden child anymore, Jasmine. You are just a woman married to a fraud." I released her wrist, giving her arm a slight shove backward. Jasmine stumbled back into her chair, clutching her arm and looking at me as if I were a stranger. Vivian was hyperventilating, holding a napkin to her chest, while the elite members of her Jack and Jill chapter watched her family publicly self-destruct. Marcus slammed his hands on the table and stood up to his full height. He tried to use his booming, authoritative voice, the same voice he had used to terrorize and control me throughout my entire childhood. He pointed a commanding finger at me, his face twisted in patriarchal fury. "Unfreeze his money right now," Marcus demanded, spit flying from his lips. "I am your father and you will obey me. You carry the Pierce name and you owe this family for raising you. You will not disrespect your sister, and you will not destroy this family's reputation in front of my peers. Fix this right now, or I swear to God I will ruin you." I did not need to answer him. From the shadows of a highly exclusive VIP booth, just a few yards away, a tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out into the main dining room. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit and carried a thick leather-bound file. It was Elias, my high-powered corporate attorney, whose hourly rate cost more than my father's entire monthly salary. The dining room watched in breathless silence as Elias walked calmly past the gawking socialites and stopped directly next to me. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply extended his arm and slapped the heavy legal file directly onto Marcus's chest, forcing my father to grab it before it fell into his ruined seafood dinner. Marcus fumbled with the thick leather-bound file Elias had just slammed against his chest. He clutched it awkwardly with both hands to keep it from sliding into his plate of half-eaten lobster. The heavy thud of the documents hitting his tailored suit echoed in the dead silence of the country club dining room. He looked at Elias with pure confusion before his eyes darted back to me. His face was a mask of patriarchal outrage, but I could see the tiny tremor in his hands. "Oh, you?" I asked, letting the words hang in the tense air. My voice was calm and steady, slicing right through the hum of whispers from the surrounding tables. "Let us talk about what I supposedly owe this family." "Open the file, Marcus." My father glared at me, his jaw clenched tight. He ripped open the cover of the file. As his eyes scanned the first page, the arrogant flush of anger drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. In a way, he had. He was looking at the ghost of his own financial crimes. "Let us talk about the $2 million commercial loan taken out using my social security number on the exact morning of my 18th birthday," I said, making sure my voice carried to the tables, where Vivian's elite friends were pretending not to listen. "Let us talk about how you used your own daughter to secure fraudulent capital to save your failing wealth management firm. You forged my signature on federal documents while I was eating a slice of cheap birthday cake in my bedroom, completely unaware that my own parents were destroying my financial future before my adult life even began." Vivian gasped loudly, pressing both hands against her pearl necklace. She looked around frantically, realizing that her carefully curated image as a philanthropist and devoted mother was disintegrating in real time. Instead of apologizing, she resorted to the only defense mechanism she knew. She immediately played the victim. "We did it for the family!" Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking in a theatrical display of martyrdom. Tears welled in her eyes, perfectly timed for the audience watching us. "You had a roof over your head. You had food on your plate. If your father's company had gone under, we would have lost everything. We would have been ruined. How can you be so ungrateful? Are you going to put your own mother in federal prison over some silly paperwork?" I stared at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing. "You did not do it to keep a roof over my head, Mom. You did it to keep your membership at this exact country club. You did it to pay for Jasmine's lavish wedding, and to keep up appearances with women who are currently recording your meltdown on their smartphones. You stole my identity, ruined my credit, and laughed when I had to take on 3 jobs just to eat during college. You called me a failure while you were spending stolen money attached to my name." Bradley, ever the opportunistic parasite, saw the situation spiraling out of control. He stepped forward, slicking back his blonde hair, trying to project the calm confidence of a seasoned tech executive dealing with a hysterical woman. He shot a nervous glance at Elias before turning his condescending gaze toward me. "Listen to me, sweetheart," Bradley said, lowering his voice to a patronizing register. "You clearly do not understand corporate veil laws or statute of limitations. This is a family dispute, not a federal case. You drag Marcus into court, and it will take years of expensive litigation that will only drain your own bank accounts. Be reasonable. Drop this ridiculous vendetta, sign a non-disclosure agreement tonight, and I will personally give you a 5% pity stake in my startup. You will get a decent payout when we go public and everyone walks away happy." I looked at Bradley, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of a mediocre man trying to manipulate a woman who had already outsmarted him. I did not raise my voice. I simply extended my hand to Elias. My attorney flawlessly produced a second document, a bound forensic audit report, and placed it in my palm. I threw the audit report directly at Bradley. It hit his chest and fell to the floor, scattering pages of highlighted banking transactions across the expensive carpet. "Your startup is a shell," I stated, my tone devoid of any mercy. "You do not have a product. You do not have a user base. You do not even have an original line of code. What you do have is a highly illegal money laundering operation. You took the $2 million my father stole under my name, funneled it through offshore accounts, and washed it right back into Pierce Wealth through fake consulting fees charged by your fake startup. You thought using decentralized crypto wallets would hide the trail, but my artificial intelligence platform unraveled your entire financial network in less than 4 seconds." Jasmine let out a horrified squeak, clutching her designer handbag as if it could protect her from the reality of her husband's impending federal indictment. Bradley's arrogant posture collapsed entirely. His mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single lie to counter the absolute proof scattered on the floor beneath his Italian loafers. Marcus was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as the walls of his fraudulent empire closed in on him. His eyes darted wildly around the dining room. Prominent judges, real estate tycoons, and medical professionals were whispering behind their menus, their eyes fixed on our table. The shame was too much for his fragile ego to bear. He needed to assert his dominance. He needed to prove he was still the patriarch, the man in charge. Marcus turned his back on me and frantically snapped his fingers in the air. "Security!" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Security, get over here right now!" 2 burly security guards in dark suits immediately began rushing toward our table from the main lobby, followed closely by the club's head of security, a tall, imposing man named Harrison. Marcus pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face as they approached. "Throw this psycho out immediately!" Marcus commanded, his face twisted in desperate rage. "She is harassing club members. She is making terroristic threats against my family. She is trespassing on private property. I want her physically removed from this dining room and thrown out into the street where she belongs." The 2 security guards reached the table, their hands hovering near their radios, ready to grab me. But before they could take a single step closer, Harrison, the head of security, threw out his arms, stopping his men dead in their tracks. Harrison did not look at Marcus. He did not look at my mother, who was still sobbing into her napkin, or at Jasmine, who was trembling in her seat. Instead, the head of security turned his imposing frame entirely toward me. He planted his feet together, straightened his posture, and bowed his head in a gesture of absolute, undeniable respect. Marcus froze, his arms still suspended in the air. He blinked rapidly, his brain completely failing to process the scene unfolding in front of him. "Harrison, what are you doing?" My father barked, his voice cracking with panic. "I gave you a direct order. Grab this woman and throw her out of my country club." Harrison slowly straightened up. He did not look at me, keeping his gaze respectfully lowered, but he turned his head just enough to address my father. The look in the security chief's eyes was not one of compliance. It was pure, unadulterated pity. "I am sorry, Mr. Pierce," Harrison said, his deep voice carrying across the silent dining room. "I cannot follow that order. I cannot remove her from the premises." Marcus turned a mottled shade of crimson. "What do you mean you cannot remove her? I pay $50,000 a year in membership dues. I am a founding member of this chapter. I will have you fired. I will have your entire department replaced by morning." Sir Harrison replied smoothly, clasping his hands behind his back. "You do not have the authority to fire me, and neither does the board of directors." As of 8 o'clock this morning, the Oakmont Country Club, including the golf course, the surrounding real estate, and all operational management, was acquired by a private holding company. Vivian let out a sharp gasp, her perfectly manicured hands flying up to her mouth. Bradley and Jasmine stared at Harrison, the color completely draining from their faces. Harrison turned back to face me, giving another slight bow. "Ms. Aaliyah is the sole owner of that holding company," he announced to the room. "She does not just have a membership here. She owns the building you are standing in." The entire dining room of Atlanta's elite fell dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick Persian rugs. The wealthy socialites, the judges, the real estate tycoons who had previously looked at me with disdain were now staring at me with absolute terror. They knew exactly what kind of power I wielded now. I looked down at my parents. They looked so incredibly small. The grand, untouchable patriarch and the flawless socialite matriarch were reduced to trembling figures sitting in front of a ruined seafood dinner. "You cannot do this," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling so badly it was barely audible. "You cannot buy this club. This is our community. This is our home." "Your home is currently in foreclosure," I reminded her, keeping my tone perfectly even. "And as for your community, I think they have seen enough of your true colors for one afternoon." I turned to Harrison. The security chief was waiting for my command. "Harrison," I said clearly, ensuring every single person in the room heard my decree. "The Pierce family's membership is permanently revoked, effective immediately. They are no longer welcome on my property. Escort them out." Marcus tried to stand his ground, puffing out his chest one last time. "You will not touch us. We are leaving on our own." But his legs betrayed him. He stumbled, bumping into the table and knocking over a crystal champagne flute. Harrison gestured to the two burly guards behind him. They stepped forward, instantly flanking my father and grabbing him firmly by the arms. "Get your hands off me," Marcus roared, struggling against their iron grip. "I am Marcus Pierce. You will regret this." The guards ignored his empty threats forcefully, marching him away from the table. Vivian shrieked in horror as another guard approached her. She scrambled out of her chair, her designer heels slipping on the polished hardwood floor. Her expensive clutch fell, spilling lipstick and credit cards everywhere, but she did not even try to pick it up. "My social standing," Vivian wailed, tears streaming down her face as she was herded toward the exit. "Aaliyah, you are destroying us. What will my friends say?" "Nobody is looking at your friends, Mom," I said simply. "They are looking at you." Jasmine was sobbing uncontrollably, clinging to Bradley's arm as they were ushered out behind my parents. Bradley, trying to maintain some shred of his dignity, attempted to walk out with his head held high. But he was walking too fast, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The toe of his expensive loafer caught the edge of a thick rug. He tripped violently, pitching forward and crashing hard onto the floor, pulling Jasmine down with him. The sound of their fall echoed through the dining room. Several people actually laughed. Bradley scrambled to his feet, his face burning bright red, and practically dragged Jasmine out the front doors, fleeing into the suffocating Atlanta heat. I watched the heavy mahogany doors close behind them. The silence in the room was palpable. I calmly pulled out a chair, sat down at a clean table, and signaled the waiter. "I will take a glass of your best vintage," I told him. "Put it on my tab." The next morning, the Atlanta skyline was painted in brilliant shades of gold as I sat behind the massive glass desk in my penthouse office at Nexus AI. The chaos of yesterday felt like a lifetime away. I was sipping a freshly brewed espresso, reviewing the overnight global market reports when the heavy oak doors to my office swung open. My executive assistant, a fiercely loyal woman named Chloe, walked in briskly. She held a sleek tablet against her chest, her expression tight with urgency. "Good morning, Chloe," I said, not looking up from my monitor. "Tell me we secured the European server farms." "We did, ma'am," Chloe replied smoothly. "But that is not why I am interrupting you. We currently have a serious situation developing in the main lobby." I finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What kind of situation?" "Bradley Hayes is downstairs," Chloe said, her voice dropping a fraction of an inch. "He bypassed the first security checkpoint by claiming he had a family emergency. Security detained him at the elevator banks, but he is refusing to leave." I sighed, setting down my coffee cup. "Have building security throw him out. I do not have time for his tantrums today." Chloe stepped closer to my desk. "He is highly agitated, ma'am. He is screaming at the guards. He says if you do not unfreeze the $5 million from Vulture Capital immediately, he is going directly to the press." I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "The press? What exactly does he think the press cares about a failed seed round?" Chloe swallowed hard, her professional demeanor slipping just enough to show genuine concern. "He says he is not going to the press about the funding. He says he is going to release the photos." I repeated the words slowly. A cold, predatory smile crept across my face. My assistant stood frozen, clearly expecting me to panic. Instead, I stood up and straightened my blazer. "Send him up to the main lobby," I instructed, "and ensure the tactical security team flanks him the entire time. I want him feeling untouchable right up until the moment he shatters." I walked out of my penthouse suite and took the private glass elevator down to the grand lobby of Nexus AI. The space was a monument to modern technology, boasting a 4-story high-definition LED wall that currently displayed global market analytics. I stood at the center of the perfectly polished white marble floor just as the gold-plated elevator banks chimed. Bradley strutted out of the elevator. Despite being flanked by 4 of my armed contractors, he carried himself with the unearned swagger of a mediocre white man. He was wearing the same wrinkled suit from the country club yesterday. His eyes bloodshot, but a toxic, triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He swaggered toward me and stopped a few feet away, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a silver flash drive, dangling it like a prized trophy. "Good morning, Aliyah," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "I hope you enjoyed your little power trip yesterday, but the game changes today. You see, while you were busy trying to play the ruthless billionaire, I was securing an insurance policy. On this drive are dozens of highly explicit, extremely compromising photographs of you. And I do not mean blurry smartphone pictures. I mean crystal clear, undeniable, high-resolution images that will absolutely annihilate your pristine corporate image permanently." I kept my hands clasped loosely behind my back, letting him dig his own grave. "Is that so?" I asked evenly. Bradley leaned in closer, dropping his voice into a threatening register. "You black women get a little taste of power and suddenly forget how fragile your position really is. The media is already waiting for you to slip up. TechCrunch, Forbes, The Wall Street Journal. I have a scheduled email ready to blast these photos to every major news outlet and board member in the tech industry. I have a finger on the trigger right now." He pointed a finger right at my face. "You are going to pull out your phone access, your little subsidiary, and unfreeze my $5 million valuation immediately. Then you are going to wire an additional $2 million into my offshore account for my pain and suffering. Because if you do not, you think you can play with the big boys, one click and your stock plummets. Your investors will force you out by sunset." I stared at him for a long, quiet moment. I did not blink. I did not show a single ounce of fear. The silence stretched out. He truly expected tears. He expected me to scramble for my phone and beg for mercy, just like my parents always demanded of me. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small black remote control. "You know, Bradley," I said smoothly, pointing the remote at the massive LED wall towering behind him. "You really should do your research before attempting corporate extortion." I clicked the small button. The global market analytics vanished from the massive screen. In their place, a high-definition security feed illuminated the entire lobby. The footage showed the interior of a dingy, dimly lit dive bar located on the outskirts of Atlanta. The timestamp in the corner proved the recording was from exactly 4 days ago. Bradley spun around to look at the screen. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of white. The video played in crisp, undeniable detail. It showed Bradley sitting in a sticky vinyl booth across from a known cybercriminal. The audio kicked in, echoing crystal clear through the lobby's surround sound system. Bradley's own voice boomed across the marble floors, explicitly ordering the hacker to generate deepfake pornography using my public press photos. Then the footage showed Bradley slowly sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. $10,000 in cash to ruin her life, the digital version of Bradley said on screen. I clicked the remote again, freezing the video on a massive high-resolution close-up of Bradley's face as he handed over the bribe. I turned my gaze back to my brother-in-law, who was now trembling so violently, the flash drive nearly slipped from his fingers. "Did you really try to use AI blackmail against the chief executive officer of an artificial intelligence conglomerate?" I asked, my voice laced with absolute lethal mockery. "Did you honestly believe my cybersecurity division does not monitor the dark web for my biometric data? We flagged your hacker the second he rendered the first pixel. We intercepted the files, tracked his location, and secured the bar's surveillance footage before you even paid your bar tab." Bradley opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His chest heaved with panic. He was utterly trapped, suffocating under the weight of his own profound stupidity. Before I could order security to restrain him, the heavy glass doors of the lobby violently swung open. Jasmine burst through the entrance, sprinting past the front desk in a blind, manic panic. Her designer sunglasses flew off her face as she charged toward me, her eyes wild with rage. "Leave my husband alone," Jasmine screamed out, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Stop trying to ruin our lives just because you are a miserable, lonely failure." I turned away from Bradley and looked dead into my sister's frantic eyes. I smiled, cold, calculating expression. "I am not here for his cheap deep fakes, Jasmine," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying calm. "I am here about the $10 million you embezzled from your clients' retirement funds. And look at who just arrived." Right on cue. The screeching tires of 5 matte black government SUVs shattered the quiet morning atmosphere outside the Aetherist Corporation. The heavy armored vehicles abruptly mounted the circular driveway, their massive tires skidding aggressively against the concrete. They formed a tight, impenetrable barricade, completely blocking the pristine glass entrance of the towering corporate lobby. The doors of the heavy vehicles flew open in perfect, terrifying unison. A dozen men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers, with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their backs, swarmed the front steps. They moved with absolute silent precision, immediately securing every visible exit. Simultaneously, a sleek silver luxury sedan slammed on its brakes just behind the federal barricade, nearly rear-ending the closest SUV. Marcus Pierce threw his driver's side door open before the vehicle even came to a complete halt. His face was flushed, a dangerous shade of crimson dripping with a mixture of cold sweat and sheer panic. He sprinted frantically toward the glass doors, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the pavement as he desperately tried to beat the federal agents into the building. Inside the grand atrium, Jasmine immediately abandoned her arrogant husband. She sprinted frantically across the polished marble floor, her designer heels echoing sharply. She threw herself violently behind Marcus the exact second he crossed the heavy threshold. She cowered completely behind his broad shoulders, aggressively clutching the fine fabric of his custom-tailored suit jacket, like a terrified, helpless child seeking shelter from a massive hurricane. Marcus forcefully puffed out his chest, stepping squarely in front of his trembling daughter, to physically block the path of the approaching federal agents. He aggressively adjusted his silk tie, instinctively defaulting to the arrogant, untouchable patriarch persona he had successfully used to relentlessly dominate Atlanta high society for over 30 years. He believed his sheer wealth and local influence made him entirely immune to consequence. He reached into his breast pocket with practiced, smooth precision and pulled out a thick, gold-embossed business card. He thrust it directly toward the lead FBI agent, a tall, imposing woman with steel-gray eyes who had just stepped decisively through the sliding glass doors. "There is obviously a massive, completely unfortunate misunderstanding happening here today," Marcus stated loudly, his booming voice attempting to forcefully command the sprawling corporate lobby. "I am Marcus Pierce, the founder, chairman, and chief executive officer of Pierce Wealth Management. My financial firm is absolutely pristine. We manage highly sensitive, incredibly lucrative assets for federal judges, powerful state senators, and major real estate tycoons. Whatever anonymous, baseless complaint you are currently chasing is a complete waste of federal resources. I strongly demand you call your immediate superior right now before you deeply embarrass yourselves any further." The lead FBI agent did not even blink. She did not reach out to take the gold-embossed business card. She simply let Marcus hold it awkwardly in the empty, tense space between them until his arrogant hand began to visibly shake. "I absolutely do not care who you manage money for, Mr. Pierce," the federal agent replied, her voice freezing cold and entirely devoid of any professional courtesy. "We are not responding to an anonymous, baseless complaint. We received a heavily documented comprehensive whistleblower report exactly 12 hours ago. It contains irrefutable, highly encrypted blockchain evidence. We have actively tracked exactly $10 million moving directly from Pierce Wealth elderly client trust accounts into 3 separate, heavily disguised offshore shell companies located in the Cayman Islands. Every single one of those hidden corporate accounts is legally registered under the exact name Jasmine Pierce Hayes." Jasmine let out a piercing, hysterical gasp. Her knees buckled violently, heavily, relying on her father's firm stance to keep her from collapsing entirely onto the cold marble floor. Bradley, who was still completely frozen on the far side of the massive lobby, aggressively backed away. He practically pressed his spine against the decorative stone wall, desperately trying to physically distance himself from his terrified wife. The sheer magnitude of the federal charges hung heavily and suffocatingly in the sterile corporate air. $10 million in federal wire fraud, aggravated embezzlement, and targeted elder abuse carried a mandatory minimum sentence that would absolutely ensure Jasmine spent the entire rest of her youth locked inside a tiny concrete federal cell. Marcus looked frantically from the stoic, unyielding federal agent to the terrified, sobbing daughter aggressively clutching his jacket. The pristine, supposedly untouchable Pierce family legacy was rapidly collapsing right in front of his very eyes. His breathing grew incredibly shallow and highly erratic. He needed a sacrifice immediately. He needed a convenient scapegoat to instantly absorb the catastrophic brand-destroying damage. Without a single second of hesitation, Marcus sharply turned his head and locked his desperate, furious, bloodshot eyes directly onto Aaliyah, who was standing perfectly still and completely silent in the exact center of the vast room. "It was her!" Marcus roared, his voice cracking violently, as he pointed a trembling, deeply accusatory finger straight at his youngest daughter. He aggressively shoved past the lead federal agent, marching directly toward Aaliyah with terrifying, unhinged speed. Aaliyah maliciously orchestrated this entire illegal scheme. She is the true criminal mastermind here. Marcus aggressively reached into his heavy custom-made Italian leather briefcase, which he had carried tightly into the building. He frantically pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed, highly detailed corporate authorization forms, waving them wildly in the air for the surrounding agents to clearly see. "She secretly operates as our shadow chief financial officer," Marcus shouted frantically to the federal agents, his desperate lies spilling out with practiced, terrifying ease. "She actively manipulated our outdated legacy computer systems. She intentionally hacked our internal servers to forcefully frame her own sister because of a petty, vindictive childhood rivalry. Look closely at the digital authorization logs. Every single offshore wire transfer bears Aaliyah's proprietary digital signature. She signed off on the massive embezzlement. She actively stole the retirement money to privately fund this massive artificial intelligence company, and now she is maliciously pinning the severe federal crimes on poor Jasmine just to cover her own tracks. The lead FBI agent slowly turned her unblinking gaze away from the screaming, entirely desperate patriarch. She fixed her cold, deeply calculating eyes directly onto Aaliyah's calm face. The seasoned agent reached down to her heavy black tactical belt. The sharp, terrifying metallic click echoed incredibly loudly across the highly polished marble floor as she smoothly pulled out a heavy pair of solid steel handcuffs. She took a slow, highly deliberate step toward Aaliyah, her expression transforming into an unreadable mask of uncompromising federal authority, fully ready to make an immediate high-profile arrest. Through the glass doors strode Vivian, their mother, her face pinched into a mask of manufactured outrage. She marched into the lobby like a general. Beside her walked a tall woman in a navy suit, a gold badge gleaming on her belt. Two federal officers trailed behind them, their boots thudding against the marble floor. Jasmine instantly recognized her specific theatrical cue. She lunged toward Vivian, burying her face into their mother's designer coat. Jasmine unleashed crocodile tears that streamed down her cheeks. She let out theatrical sobs, clutching the fabric like a terrified victim. "She did this to us," Jasmine wailed, pointing a trembling finger at Aaliyah. "My evil sister manipulated her tech systems to ruin us. She fabricated those financial records to frame me for the retirement funds. She has always been jealous of me. She hates that I am happily married, so she used her programs to destroy my reputation and steal my clients. She belongs in a federal prison cell." Bradley read the shift in the room. He scrambled to his feet, smoothing his suit jacket. He scurried over to stand behind Vivian and the officers. A smug smirk crept back onto his face. He crossed his arms, believing his wife's desperate counterattack had worked. He thought he was perfectly safe. Vivian wrapped a protective arm around Jasmine, glaring at Aaliyah with absolute disgust. "I always knew you were cold, but I never imagined you were this deeply disturbed," Vivian spat, her voice echoing across the marble atrium. "Framing your own flesh and blood to cover up your corporate fraud. You are a monster. I will ensure the board strips you of every share you currently own." The lead federal agent stepped forward, her professional expression unreadable. She unclipped heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical belt, the metal clinking sharply in the quiet room. The distinct sound made Bradley's arrogant smirk widen. "Aaliyah Vance," the lead agent began, her stern voice carrying authoritative weight. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest regarding the fraudulent transfer of $10 million from the Vanguard Trust authorized by a digital signature." Vivian did not wait for the agent to finish. "Arrest her!" Vivian screamed, her composure vanishing as she pointed wildly at her daughter. "Put her in chains. She is a dangerous sociopath. She has been trying to destroy this family ever since she was a teenager, and now she is stealing from retirees to fund her tech empire." Alia did not even flinch at the sudden screaming. She did not raise her voice in protest. She turned away from her mother and walked toward the espresso bar in the lobby. Her personal assistant, who had been watching the exchange with calculated efficiency, handed Aaliyah an espresso in a porcelain cup. Aaliyah took a slow, deliberate sip. The steam curled into the overhead lighting. She looked completely unbothered by the steel handcuffs clinking just feet away. The chilling calm, radiating from Aaliyah, caused Jasmine's fake sobs to falter for a noticeable fraction of a second. "Are you deaf?" Vivian angrily demanded, stepping toward the federal officers. "She is openly mocking you. Put the cuffs on her immediately." Alia slowly lowered her porcelain cup. She stepped forward and gracefully extended her right wrist directly toward the agent. The confident gesture was so willing and devoid of fear that the federal agent actually hesitated. Alia did not address her screaming mother, nor her crying sister, nor the smug brother-in-law. She spoke directly and clearly to the federal agent. "Before you lock those metal bracelets on my wrists, I strongly suggest you check the exact metadata on that digital signature you just mentioned." Alia said, her tone smooth and razor-sharp. "You will find a very interesting anomaly. The signature was indeed generated using my account credentials. However, the system logs will clearly show that it was executed from an external IP address. Specifically, it was generated from the primary IP address registered to Bradley's so-called startup office downtown. Bradley's smirk vanished instantly. His arms dropped heavily to his sides, and the remaining blood drained rapidly from his face for the second time that morning. Jasmine stopped crying, completely whipping her head around to stare at her husband in absolute horror. Aaliyah took another calm sip of her espresso, letting the crushing silence stretch just long enough to completely suffocate them. Furthermore, Aaliyah continued smoothly, a dangerously polite smile forming slowly on her lips. I suggest you look closely at the exact timestamp on that forged authorization document, on the precise date and time that document was supposedly signed and executed in Atlanta. I was physically standing on a brightly lit stage delivering a keynote address on global cybersecurity in Tokyo. There were 5,000 prominent people in the live audience, and the entire event was globally streamed. My personal passport, complete with the official Japanese customs stamps verifying my travel dates, is sitting right now in the top drawer of my desk upstairs. Vivian opened her mouth to yell another wild accusation, but the furious words died instantly in her throat. The sheer volume of undeniable evidence crashed down upon her like a solid concrete wall. Aaliyah handed her empty porcelain cup back to her silent assistant. She then looked the lead federal agent directly in the eyes. Her dangerously polite smile shifted seamlessly into an expression of genuine familiarity. "Oh, and Agent Carter," Aaliyah said softly, her confident voice carrying effortlessly across the tense silent space. "It is genuinely very good to see you again today. I believe the last time we collaborated closely was when my firm built the financial tracking algorithm for your cybercrime division." Agent Carter, who had maintained a rigidly stoic federal facade until this exact moment, suddenly let out a small, amused huff of air. She slowly lowered the heavy steel handcuffs and tucked them neatly back into her black tactical belt. Agent Carter smiled very warmly back at Aaliyah. The entire Pierce family froze, as if they were cast in heavy, solid concrete, right there in the lobby. Vivian abruptly stopped breathing, her widened eyes darting frantically between her youngest daughter and the imposing federal agent standing nearby. Jasmine slowly lowered her trembling hands from her face, the fake theatrical tears drying almost instantly on her flushed, panicking skin. Bradley took a sudden heavy step backward, his polished leather shoes squeaking loudly against the pristine marble floor. Agent Carter securely snapped the black canvas flap of her tactical pouch over the steel handcuffs, turning her full attention toward them. Agent Carter was my chief of cybersecurity at Ethers Corporation for 3 highly productive years before she ultimately decided to rejoin the bureau. Aaliyah explained calmly to her utterly stunned relatives. Her steady voice was completely conversational, entirely devoid of any malicious intent, which somehow only made the shocking revelation significantly more devastating to hear. When I initially detected the very first security breach inside the Vanguard Trust accounts late last month, I deliberately did not call the local city police department. Instead, I immediately called my former trusted colleague to handle the complex situation securely and extremely quietly. I formally handed her the complete unredacted encryption keys to Bradley's supposedly secure private server exactly 3 days ago. Aaliyah continued smoothly, gesturing gracefully toward the stoic federal officer. Agent Carter nodded briskly pulling a sleek digital tablet from her dark navy jacket pocket. She expertly tapped the illuminated glass screen, instantly projecting a highly detailed, glowing holographic summary of the fraudulent financial transfers directly into the cold, conditioned air circulating within the massive, cavernous corporate lobby. The undeniable glowing proof of their massive financial crimes floated right in front of their deeply terrified, absolutely stunned, and incredibly pale faces. "We have been actively monitoring every single individual keystroke your desperate husband made during the last 72 hours, Jasmine," Agent Carter stated firmly, her tone returning instantly to its sharp, uncompromising federal authority. "We clearly watched him systematically route the massively embezzled funds through 4 separate, heavily disguised offshore shell companies located in the Cayman Islands. We also watched him desperately attempt to electronically spoof the Ethers corporate network IP address very early this morning. It was a remarkably amateurish, poorly coded, and completely transparent hacking attempt that my junior analyst flagged within approximately 10 seconds of initial execution. Standing rigidly in the far corner of the sprawling lobby, Marcus Pierce finally realized the true catastrophic magnitude of the unfolding disaster. Marcus had spent his entire adult life ruthlessly pulling the hidden strings of the lucrative family trust, always playing the untouchable authoritative patriarch. He had meticulously orchestrated this intricate golden trap, arrogantly assuming Aaliyah would simply surrender her valuable company shares to quickly avoid a massive, brand-destroying public scandal. Now he plainly saw the armed federal agents aggressively flanking the main exit doors. He clearly saw the damning digital evidence hovering brightly in the surrounding ambient air. The absolute realization of total defeat hit him with immense physical force. Marcus abruptly spun around cowardly, abandoning his terrified wife and panicked daughter without a second thought. He lunged desperately toward the private executive elevators located on the far side of the atrium, his heavy, frantic footsteps echoing incredibly loudly across the expansive stone floor. He did not make it very far before encountering a completely impenetrable, heavily armed human wall. Two highly muscular federal agents, clad in thick tactical gear, stepped seamlessly out from behind a massive decorative marble pillar, entirely blocking his desperate, pathetic escape path completely. Marcus slammed forcefully into them, bouncing violently off their rigid armored vests like a discarded rag doll. He stumbled backward, gasping heavily for air, his expensive custom-tailored suit jacket twisting very awkwardly around his broad shoulders. One of the imposing agents aggressively grabbed Marcus by his right bicep, holding him firmly and painfully in place against the cold wall. "Leaving so incredibly soon, Marcus?" Aaliyah asked loudly, her sharp tone suddenly laced with absolute, unforgiving ice. "We have not even thoroughly discussed your personal, deeply documented role in officially authorizing the massively fraudulent trust transfers happening right here today now." Seeing the supposedly invincible, domineering family patriarch being physically restrained by armed federal agents completely shattered whatever fragile temporary composure Bradley had left. The terrifying, undeniable reality of a mandatory federal prison sentence crashed heavily down upon his shoulders. He looked wildly at the surrounding tactical agents, then frantically at Aaliyah, and finally at his hyperventilating wife. The primal, overwhelming instinct for basic self-preservation completely overrode his non-existent marital loyalty. Bradley threw both of his shaking hands high into the air, backing rapidly away from Jasmine, as if she were highly radioactive, dangerously toxic, and explosively hazardous waste material. "It was entirely her idea," Bradley screamed desperately, his terrified voice cracking painfully into a pathetic, high-pitched squeal. He pointed a trembling accusatory finger directly at Jasmine's shocked face. "I am merely a hired consultant. Jasmine forcefully ordered me to execute the illegal IP spoofing protocol. She explicitly told me if I did not actively help her successfully frame Aaliyah, she would permanently cut off my access to our massive joint bank accounts. I absolutely did not steal the millions from the elderly retirement funds. She did. This entire wealthy family is actually a massive organized criminal enterprise operation." Jasmine stared blankly at her husband, her face rapidly shifting from utter shock to a terrifying level of raw feral rage. She let out a guttural, terrifying scream and lunged forward with explosive, uncontrollable speed. She violently tackled Bradley, completely ignoring the surrounding federal agents. "You broke, miserable, disgusting parasite," Jasmine shrieked loudly, viciously striking his face as they crashed onto the floor. "You used my embezzled money to buy a luxury beachfront condo for your cheap mistress in Miami." The entire silent lobby openly watched the supposedly perfect wealthy couple aggressively tear each other apart on the cold marble. Jasmine's manicured nails dug viciously into Bradley's cheek, dragging downward with enough force to tear through his skin. Four distinct bright red lines instantly appeared across his pale face, welling with blood that dripped onto his expensive collar. Bradley let out a sharp howl of pain and shoved her backward with both hands. Jasmine's high heels slipped violently on the polished marble. She crashed hard onto her back, her designer skirt riding up past her knees, but she immediately scrambled to claw at him again like a rabid animal. "You are nothing but a pathetic fraud," Bradley roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings as he wiped the blood from his face. He pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger down at his wife. "You and your entire miserable family. You look down on me because I came from nothing, but you are completely fake. Pierce wealth is an empty shell. You are drowning in massive corporate debt. Your father leveraged every single asset, every house, every car, just to keep up appearances at the country club. I am the only reason your phony empire survived this long." Before Jasmine could launch herself at his throat a second time, the federal agents moved in with brutal efficiency. Two heavily armored agents grabbed Bradley, twisting his arms roughly behind his back and slamming his face forward against the reception desk. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. Simultaneously, Agent Carter and another officer descended on Jasmine. They pinned her shoulders to the cold stone floor, ignoring her frantic shrieks and thrashing limbs. The sharp click of metal securing her wrists sounded like a final definitive period at the end of a very long, very ugly sentence. "Jasmine Pierce, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." Agent Carter recited her voice, a calm, practiced drone cutting straight through the chaotic screaming. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." In the center of the lobby, Vivian stood entirely paralyzed. Her eyes were wide, utterly hollow, tracking the brutal, uncompromising subjugation of her favorite daughter. The immaculate facade she had spent 40 years meticulously building was evaporating right in front of her face. The society galas, the charity board presidencies, the exclusive country club memberships, the carefully curated image of the flawless Pierce dynasty, all of it was gone. The reality of her impending social and financial annihilation broke her mind in a single terrifying instant. Her knees abruptly gave out. Vivian collapsed heavily onto the marble floor. Her pristine, custom-tailored silk dress pooled around her trembling legs. The haughty, commanding matriarch, who had marched through the glass doors just minutes earlier, had vanished completely. In her place was a broken, terrified, pathetic woman. She looked at Marcus, who was still pinned securely against the decorative pillar by two agents, aggressively refusing to make eye contact with her. How was already calculating his own separate defense strategy, abandoning her just as quickly as he had abandoned his daughter. Vivian turned her frantic, desperate gaze toward the only person left in the room holding any actual power. She got onto her hands and knees. The cold stone bit into her skin, but she did not care. She practically crawled across the lobby floor, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly across her tear-streaked face. She reached out with a shaking manicured hand, desperately trying to grab the hem of Aaliyah's crisp suit jacket. Alia took a single deliberate step backward. She looked down at the woman who had birthed her, her expression completely devoid of any warmth, pity, or even lingering anger. It was a look of absolute chilling indifference. "Alia, my baby, please, you have to listen to me!" Vivian cried out, her voice a ragged, hysterical sob that echoed pitifully in the cavernous space. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. Blood is thicker than water. You are a billionaire. Aaliyah, you have more money than you could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. Just buy Pierce wealth, pay off the SEC fines, make these federal agents go away. You have the power to fix this right now. You cannot let your own mother die rotting in a federal penitentiary." The entire lobby fell entirely silent, save for the heavy breathing of the restrained prisoners and the distant hum of the central air conditioning. Even the federal agents paused for a fraction of a second, quietly observing the pathetic spectacle of a fallen socialite, begging the daughter she had always relentlessly tormented. Alia did not flinch. She did not break eye contact. She stood perfectly still, letting the pathetic weight of her mother's desperate plea hang heavy in the sterile corporate air. "Blood is thicker than water." Aaliyah repeated, her voice smooth, level, and sharp enough to cut glass. "That is a very funny choice of words, Vivian. Because that is certainly not what Dad's text message said on the day of my college graduation. Vivian's breath hitched in her throat. The color drained entirely from her already pale face as the memory of that specific day hit her like a physical blow. I remember it perfectly. Aaliyah continued, her tone conversational, but laced with lethal precision. I was standing outside the auditorium holding my honors degree in computer science. The degree you both refused to help pay for. The degree you said was a massive waste of time for a woman. I texted asking if you were coming to the ceremony. Dad replied that the family was too busy hosting a yacht party for Jasmine's new promotion. He said, and I quote, that true family is built on shared success, not shared blood, and I was clearly destined to be a miserable failure. Alia reached calmly into the interior breast pocket of her tailored suit jacket. She withdrew a thick, securely bound legal document folded neatly in half. She held it up, letting the harsh overhead lobby lights illuminate the heavy black text and the bright red notarized official seals stamped across the bottom page. I will not buy your company, Mom, Aaliyah stated flatly, stepping closer to look directly into her mother's terrified, weeping eyes. I already bought your debt. Alia flipped open the heavy legal document, letting the crisp pages rustle sharply in the dead silence of the lobby. She stepped directly over the pool of designer silk cascading from her mother's trembling form. She walked purposefully toward her father, who was still securely pinned against the decorative marble pillar by the federal agents. Marcus glared at her with hatred, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked ready to shatter under the immense pressure. Alia calmly held the primary signature page up to his face, forcing him to look at his own disastrous decisions. Exactly 3 weeks ago, your primary institutional lenders quietly bundled Pierce Wealth's entire $50 million toxic debt portfolio into one undesirable package. Aaliyah stated firmly, her confident voice projecting effortlessly across the vast echoing room. Those Wall Street banks were desperate to offload the massive liability before their fiscal quarter ended. They knew you were secretly insolvent. My private holding company swooped in and acquired every single outstanding promissory note for roughly 12 cents on the dollar. I am now your sole undivided creditor, Marcus. Pierce Wealth is officially bankrupt as of 9 o'clock this morning, and you have absolutely zero financial leverage remaining. Marcus strained against the federal agents, his aging face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The undeniable reality of the notarized signatures staring back at him finally shattered his arrogant delusion of absolute supremacy. Alia lowered the heavy document, her icy gaze locking onto his deeply panicked, bloodshot eyes. You heavily leveraged absolutely everything to maintain your fake billionaire lifestyle. She continued, her tone clinical and utterly devoid of any human mercy. According to the explicit terms of these newly acquired financial contracts, all of your personal luxury assets are designated as direct corporate collateral. The sprawling Buckhead mansion, the fleet of vintage European sports cars, the hidden overseas bank accounts, the private country club shares, and even Vivian's absurd collection of insured diamond jewelry. Every single piece of it belongs to me now. Marcus aggressively twisted his broad shoulders, desperately trying to break free from the tactical agents holding him firmly against the stone wall. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood, Marcus roared, his previously commanding voice cracking pathetically under the crushing weight of his total defeat. I am your father. I gave you everything. You owe me your entire life. Aaliyah stared back at him with absolute zero emotion, perfectly mirroring the coldness he had shown her for decades. I am not doing anything, she replied smoothly, her voice a chilling whisper that carried perfectly. I am simply enforcing the very specific, highly predatory financial contracts that you willingly signed when you thought you were completely invincible. Agent Carter subtly signaled her tactical team with a sharp nod. The armed officers hauled Bradley and Jasmine forcefully off the polished marble floor. Jasmine was sobbing hysterically now, her makeup running down her face as her manicured hands were bound tightly in steel handcuffs. Bradley kept his head down, completely broken, humiliated, and silent as reality set in. The federal agents marched the disgraced couple out through the heavy glass lobby doors, pushing them firmly into the secure back seat of a waiting armored transport vehicle. The blinding flash of federal sirens painted the pristine corporate lobby in shades of red and blue light. As the heavy doors swung shut, two tall men wearing sharp-tailored gray suits stepped gracefully from the private executive elevator bank. They were the senior partners of Aaliyah's elite asset management team. The taller man walked directly over to Vivian, who was still kneeling helplessly on the cold stone floor, catatonic with shock. He politely handed her a crisp, single-page legal document printed on heavy paper. "This is a formal court-mandated 2-hour eviction notice," Aaliyah explained coldly, finally turning her back on her ruined parents. "My armed private security contractors are already stationed at the front gates of the Buckhead estate. You have exactly 120 minutes to pack whatever basic clothing fits into 2 standard-sized suitcases. If you attempt to quietly remove any valuable art, luxury electronics, or expensive jewelry, you will be immediately arrested for criminal theft of corporate property. Have a very pleasant afternoon, Vivian." The freezing rain poured violently over the dark city of Atlanta, exactly 6 months later. The relentless downpour battered the rusted, decaying metal roof of a $40 a night roadside motel on the absolute fringes of the desolate city limits. Inside the incredibly cramped, foul-smelling room, Vivian sat shivering uncontrollably on the edge of a sagging, deeply stained mattress. She wore a faded, pilled gray sweater, her once immaculate blonde hair, now a tangled, greasy mess. The broken neon vacancy sign, buzzing directly outside their cracked window, cast a sickly, flickering green light across her sunken, exhausted face. Marcus paced frantically back and forth across the peeling, sticky linoleum floor, muttering under his breath. The heavy, oppressive dampness of the terrible room clung tightly to his cheap, ill-fitting thrift store suit. He suddenly stopped his manic pacing and held up a crumpled, slightly damp piece of premium black cardstock. It was a highly coveted, incredibly rare VIP entry ticket to the exclusive Global Tech Gala happening downtown later that evening. Marcus stared at the shiny gold foil lettering with a desperate, manic intensity burning fiercely in his bloodshot, exhausted eyes. He smoothed the wrinkled ticket against his chest, his hands shaking violently from the freezing draft, leaking continuously through the badly broken window frame. "We just need to locate the anonymous mega-investor tonight," Marcus muttered feverishly, his voice a hoarse, desperate, terrifying whisper. "The massive industry rumors say this silent billionaire is aggressively funding massive corporate resurrections right now. We can easily pitch a brilliant, flawless comeback strategy. We just need one small seed investment to pay for our federal defense lawyers and completely crush Aaliyah once and for all forever." Vivian stood barefoot on the cracked tile of the cramped motel bathroom. She aggressively scrubbed the delicate fabric of her last remaining designer evening gown under a rusted, leaking faucet. The harsh fluorescent bulb flickered inconsistently above her head, casting ugly shadows across her exhausted face. She was desperately using a tiny rock-hard bar of generic motel soap to forcefully remove a stale coffee stain from the expensive silk. The abrasive chemicals were actively destroying the fine woven material, but she had absolutely no other option available tonight. This lavish event was their only remaining chance at survival. In the adjacent, poorly ventilated room, Marcus stood directly in front of a heavily smudged, deeply cracked mirror, loudly rehearsing his frantic business pitch. He adjusted the frayed, uneven collar of his cheap thrift store blazer, completely oblivious to his own profoundly pathetic reality. He spoke aggressively to his tired reflection with a delusional, deeply ingrained level of arrogance, loudly promising unprecedented financial returns to an imaginary room full of wealthy investors. He firmly believed his sheer charisma could magically erase $50 million of toxic corporate debt and the rapidly looming threat of multiple federal indictments. They were not the only former members of the shattered Pierce empire desperately grasping for a miraculous lifeline tonight. Across the sprawling, rain-soaked city, Jasmine and Bradley were legally out on bail, entirely consumed by a highly publicized, vicious, and deeply humiliating divorce. Daily tabloid magazines and aggressive online gossip blogs heavily documented their explosive, violently loud screaming matches outside the downtown federal courthouse. They were actively fighting over non-existent hidden assets, each aggressively trying to shift the entire heavy burden of the federal embezzlement charges squarely onto the other. Bradley, however, had his own incredibly desperate, highly secretive agenda for the evening. He stood nervously in the damp, garbage-filled alleyway directly behind the downtown convention center, awkwardly adjusting a terribly cheap, poorly fitting rented tuxedo. He successfully bribed a corrupt catering manager with his last $200 to slip him quietly through the guarded, restricted loading dock. Bradley was not looking for a legitimate business comeback. He was actively hunting for a wealthy, incredibly naive tech investor to serve as his personal financial savior. He desperately needed to secure a remarkably wealthy sugar mama to immediately pay his exorbitant, mounting legal fees before his mandatory federal sentencing hearing scheduled for early next month. The anticipated Global Tech Gala was undeniably the absolute most opulent, ridiculously lavish corporate event of the entire calendar year. Massive crystal chandeliers hung suspended from the soaring, elegantly painted ceilings of the grand ballroom, casting a brilliant, blinding light over the city's most powerful, intensely wealthy billionaires. Waiters dressed in pristine, sharply pressed white jackets circulated smoothly through the massive, densely packed crowd, expertly balancing heavy silver trays loaded with imported Russian caviar and rare vintage French champagne. Marcus and Vivian successfully slipped through a poorly lit side service corridor, utilizing a deeply forgotten specific favor from a disgraced former city politician to bypass the heavily armed main security checkpoint. They immediately blended directly into the dense, extremely wealthy crowd, their desperate, wildly darting eyes frantically scanning the massive room. They were aggressively searching for the highly exclusive, heavily guarded VIP enclosure. They absolutely needed immediate, unrestricted direct access to the anonymous titan of tech, the mysterious, incredibly wealthy mega investor officially sponsoring the lavish event. Marcus clutched his damp, crumpled VIP ticket incredibly tightly in his sweating palm, ready to ruthlessly ambush whoever was comfortably sitting at the prestigious head table. On the opposite side of the sprawling, incredibly noisy ballroom, Bradley expertly zeroed in on his highly specific, carefully selected prime target. He easily spotted Linda, a highly prominent, incredibly wealthy, and famously generous older venture capitalist, widely known for aggressively funding highly risky early-stage startups. She stood elegantly near a massive, intricately carved swan ice sculpture, slowly nursing a dry martini. Bradley quickly smoothed the lapels of his badly rented jacket plastered on his absolute most charming, incredibly fake tech bro smile, and confidently swooped directly into her immediate personal space. He flawlessly launched into his heavily rehearsed, entirely fabricated sob story, his smooth voice dripping heavily with manufactured, deeply insincere earnestness. He confidently claimed he was a highly brilliant, intensely misunderstood young founder whose genuinely revolutionary, highly lucrative mobile application was ruthlessly, illegally stolen by massive, incredibly evil corporate vultures. He leaned in incredibly close, actively utilizing every single ounce of manipulative, highly practiced charm he still possessed, quietly suggesting that a massive, completely immediate cash investment could easily help him reclaim his stolen intellectual property and absolutely guarantee her an astronomically high financial return. Linda listened quite politely, a mildly intrigued, slightly amused expression slowly forming on her highly sophisticated, elegantly aged face. She took a very slow, highly deliberate sip of her crisp martini, carefully considering his passionate, incredibly desperate pitch. Bradley instantly felt a massive, completely overwhelming surge of pure adrenaline. He honestly believed he was actually going to successfully pull this completely insane gamble off tonight. I truly believed he was rapidly going to secure the massive funding, immediately hire the absolute best defense attorney in the entire state, and permanently avoid a deeply terrifying, completely ruinous stay in federal prison. He eagerly opened his mouth to completely close the financial deal, fully ready to boldly ask for a massive wire transfer directly to his empty legal trust account. Before Bradley could confidently utter a single pathetic syllable to close his deeply fraudulent and desperate deal, a flawlessly calm, incredibly razor-sharp voice sliced cleanly and devastatingly through the ambient heavy noise of the crowded ballroom. I highly recommend you. Absolutely do not invest a single dime in him, Linda. The deeply familiar, incredibly powerful voice commanded absolutely effortlessly. He is currently facing 15 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary for massive, deeply documented wire fraud and organized grand larceny. Then Aaliyah steps out of the shadows. Bradley's face drained of all color, transforming instantly into a sickly, chalky white beneath the unforgiving glare of the massive crystal chandeliers suspended overhead. He stumbled backward, his cheap rental shoes slipping awkwardly on the highly polished marble floor. His manufactured confidence shattered into a million jagged pieces. Linda did not flinch at the commanding interruption from the shadows. Instead, her sophisticated, heavily guarded expression melted away, replaced by a remarkably warm, deeply respectful smile. She completely ignored the panicking man standing right in front of her. She eagerly extended her manicured hands toward the new arrival with genuine excitement. "Aaliyah!" Linda exclaimed loudly, her crisp voice carrying a distinct tone of absolute professional reverence that Bradley had desperately spent his entire adult life trying to command. "It is an absolute pleasure to see you again this evening. We were just discussing your algorithmic breakthrough at the board meeting. Tell me, is this sweating gentleman, the pathetic fraudster, you explicitly warned the Executive Oversight Committee about during our emergency conference call yesterday morning?" Alia stepped fully into the bright ambient light of the sprawling grand ballroom. She looked impeccably sharp and effortlessly powerful in a midnight blue tuxedo jacket that perfectly contrasted with the sea of traditional black suits. She nodded slowly, her calm, deeply calculating eyes locking directly onto Bradley's terrified pale face. "Yes, Linda, this is precisely the man," Aaliyah confirmed smoothly, her voice devoid of any human pity. "He has a highly documented history of aggressively siphoning millions from vulnerable investors to privately finance his failing highly derivative technological ventures." The crushing humiliation of being casually exposed in front of Silicon Valley royalty snapped whatever fragile restraint Bradley had left. He frantically waved his arms loudly, attempting to cause a massive disruptive scene to salvage his ruined reputation. "She is a complete malicious liar," Bradley screamed, his desperate voice echoing violently over the soft jazz music playing in the background. "She maliciously orchestrated this fake federal investigation using forged digital evidence just to steal my valuable intellectual property. You cannot listen to a single word she says." Linda sighed deeply, looking at Bradley with the exact same clinical disgust she would reserve for a filthy cockroach crawling brazenly across her pristine dining room table. She did not even bother responding to his frantic, sweaty outburst. Instead, she smoothly raised her right hand and snapped her fingers exactly twice. Immediately, four massive, highly intimidating private security guards wearing dark suits seamlessly materialized from the surrounding shadows, instantly surrounding Bradley. "Remove this completely unhinged man from my immediate vicinity," Linda ordered coldly, turning her back on him to face Aaliyah. "And securely forward all his personal contact information directly to my executive assistant. I want to make absolutely sure every prominent venture capitalist operating in Silicon Valley gets a high-resolution color copy of his federal mugshot before they eat breakfast tomorrow morning." The towering, muscular security guards grabbed Bradley by both of his arms, completely ignoring his hysterical protests. They aggressively dragged him backward across the crowded ballroom floor. Dozens of wealthy, influential guests stepped aside in sheer disgust, holding their expensive crystal champagne flutes far away from the thrashing man. They openly whispered, pointed, and quietly laughed at the public spectacle unfolding before them. Bradley kicked his legs wildly in the air, violently tearing the cheap fabric of his rented tuxedo pants. But the massive guards simply tightened their unbreakable grips on his bruising shoulders. They forcefully shoved him through the heavy swinging double doors of the catering kitchen, marching him ruthlessly down a long, dimly lit, grease-stained concrete hallway leading directly toward the rear loading dock of the massive convention center. When the guards forcefully kicked open the heavy metal service doors, the freezing, relentless Atlanta rain blasted heavily into the narrow corridor, instantly soaking everyone. Bradley stumbled awkwardly out into the dark, garbage-filled alleyway, violently gasping for cold air, only to instantly freeze in sheer paralyzing terror. Two stern, heavily armed federal marshals were standing patiently beside a dark, unmarked government SUV, their thick tactical raincoats slick with heavy rainwater. Bradley Pierce, the much taller federal marshal, barked loudly, stepping rapidly forward to aggressively slam Bradley roughly against the wet side of the heavy steel vehicle. Your previously approved federal bail agreement has been officially revoked by the presiding district judge due to a newly filed, highly credible flight risk assessment. You are going straight back into a maximum security federal holding cell tonight. The freezing cold steel of a brand new set of heavy-duty handcuffs snapped brutally tight around his chafed wrists. Bradley instantly began screaming hysterically violently, thrashing his wet head back and forth as the strong marshals shoved him forcefully into the dark, secure steel cage installed in the back of the vehicle. His pathetic, desperate cries for mercy were completely swallowed by the sudden deafening roar of the raging thunderstorm tearing through the dark city sky overhead. Back inside the brilliantly illuminated main ballroom, the sudden commotion sent an electric ripple of hushed excitement spreading rapidly through the massive crowd. Standing nervously near the silver buffet tables, Marcus and Vivian eagerly stretched their necks, desperately trying to see the source of the disturbance. They were completely blocked by an impenetrable wall of tall executives and absolutely did not see Aaliyah. Marcus aggressively grabbed Vivian by her damp sweater sleeve, his manic eyes fixed firmly and intensely on the beautifully and brightly lit main stage at the far end. The elegant master of ceremonies had just stepped up to the glowing crystal podium. "This is our perfect chance to survive," Marcus hissed frantically, shoving a startled software developer out of his direct path. "The anonymous mega investor is stepping up right now to address the crowd. Get ready to pitch exactly like we practiced today." Marcus and Vivian desperately pushed toward the front row, entirely blind to the ultimate trap that had just snapped shut around them forever. Marcus aggressively drove his heavy, damp shoulder directly between a prominent tech billionaire and a respected federal senator, ignoring their indignant gasps. He dragged Vivian by her trembling wrist, his cheap thrift store suit brushing offensively against velvet tuxedo jackets and custom silk gowns. They elbowed violently through the densely packed, glittering crowd, stepping recklessly onto the polished shoes of legitimate billionaires. The humiliating contrast between the ruined couple and the elite of high society was painfully obvious. The heavy stench of stale motel cigarette smoke clung to their damp clothes, polluting the air scented with imported perfumes. Several heavily guarded venture capitalists scowled at the desperate couple invading their space, but Marcus was entirely consumed by his manic delusion of grandeur. He clawed his way to the front edge of the VIP perimeter, pressing his chest against the crimson velvet security rope. Vivian leaned close to his ear, her stale breath trembling with unearned hope. "This is it, Marcus," Vivian whispered intensely, her greasy blonde hair sticking to her sunken cheeks. "This is our ultimate salvation tonight. We get this angel funding secured immediately. We take their millions, hire the most ruthless federal defense attorneys, and finally crush Aaliyah in court." Marcus nodded sharply, a greedy gleam flashing in his bloodshot eyes. He clutched his stack of badly printed corporate business cards so tightly his knuckles turned white, ready to desperately pounce on their prey. The ambient background jazz music suddenly faded into complete dramatic silence. The massive crystal chandeliers, suspended high above the grand ballroom, slowly dimmed, plunging the opulent space into a heavy, expectant darkness. A single blindingly white spotlight instantly snapped on, illuminating the exact center of the main stage. An elegantly dressed master of ceremonies stepped confidently up to the glowing crystal podium, lightly tapping the silver microphone. The dull thud echoed powerfully across the breathless crowd of thousands. Every single powerful chief executive, wealthy investor, and influential politician instantly turned their undivided attention toward the main stage. Marcus and Vivian instinctively held their breath, their anxious hearts pounding against their rib cages in rapid sync. This was the exact moment their entire fraudulent comeback strategy depended upon. The master of ceremonies smiled warmly, gripping the clear edges of the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," his booming, perfectly modulated voice echoed flawlessly through the surround sound system. "Tonight's spectacular event is made entirely possible by a singular, truly unparalleled visionary. We are gathered here tonight to formally honor a brilliant woman who single-handedly built a multi-billion-dollar artificial intelligence empire directly from a tiny college dorm room." Marcus leaned aggressively over the velvet security rope, his desperate eyes wide with terrifying anticipation. He had already meticulously formulated his manipulative opening pitch in his greedy mind, completely ready to ruthlessly ambush this mysterious billionaire, the exact second she stepped down from the elevated stage. The master of ceremonies smoothly raised his right hand, gesturing grandly toward the sweeping white marble staircase, positioned directly behind the illuminated main stage. "Please join me in giving a massive, incredibly warm welcome to the sole founder, the visionary chief executive officer, and our generous anonymous sponsor for this remarkable evening," the master of ceremonies announced proudly, his voice rising steadily in sheer excitement. "Miss Aaliyah Pierce." The familiar name blasted violently through the massive acoustic speakers like a physical shockwave. Marcus instantly froze in place, his manic, greedy smile paralyzing on his sweating face. His aging brain aggressively rejected the impossible auditory information it had just brutally processed. He blinked rapidly, entirely convinced the master of ceremonies had just suffered a catastrophic verbal slip. Vivian let out a sharp, pathetic gasp, her shaking hands violently flying up to tightly cover her trembling mouth. The name loudly echoed and continuously reverberated across the cavernous ballroom, bouncing sharply off the soaring ceilings and crashing heavily back down onto their absolutely shattered reality. The entire elite crowd of thousands instantly erupted into a deafening, thunderous roar of genuine applause, completely drowning out the terrified whimpers rapidly escaping Vivian's constricted throat. A second blindingly bright spotlight aggressively snapped on, tracking directly and swiftly to the highest landing of the sweeping grand staircase. Aaliyah stood perfectly positioned there, looking slowly down at the massive, wildly cheering crowd, exactly like a ruthless, conquering monarch, calmly surveying her newly acquired empire. She wore a breathtaking, flawlessly custom-tailored red silk gown that flowed elegantly around her athletic body like pure liquid fire. The deeply vibrant, unapologetic color of the expensive fabric commanded absolute terrifying authority. She wore absolutely no visible jewelry on her neck or wrists, requiring zero external diamonds to loudly broadcast her immense, untouchable personal wealth. She simply radiated pure, devastating, calculated power. Her posture was impeccably straight, her beautiful expression completely calm, terrifyingly cold, and undeniably victorious. The entire massive ballroom of powerful tech billionaires, elite government politicians, and ruthless venture capitalists simultaneously rose directly to their feet, delivering a massive, sustained standing ovation. They clapped passionately, turning their wealthy faces upward in absolute awe of the brilliant young woman who currently controlled the most advanced artificial intelligence algorithms on the planet. Marcus stared blankly up at his youngest, deeply despised daughter, his jaw hanging completely slack. His violently shaking fingers finally lost their desperate grip. The thick stack of cheap, fraudulent business cards slipped silently from his sweating hands, fluttering helplessly down onto the polished marble floor, to be instantly trampled by the expensive custom leather shoes of the wildly cheering crowd. Vivian physically could not begin to process the sheer magnitude of her total, inescapable defeat. The crushing realization that her abused daughter was actually the ultimate titan of tech completely shattered her final remaining sliver of sanity. Vivian's weak knees instantly gave out beneath her damp skirt. She collapsed violently against the thick crimson velvet security rope, sliding helplessly down onto the freezing cold marble floor, permanently drowning in the deafening thunderous roar of Aaliyah's absolute undeniable and truly spectacular corporate triumph. Aaliyah descended the sweeping white marble staircase with the calculated, unhurried grace of an absolute monarch claiming her throne. Every step she took in that breathtaking red silk gown commanded the undivided attention of the sprawling, silent ballroom. The heavy fabric trailed behind her like liquid fire, a stark contrast to the sterile black tuxedos and subdued evening wear of the surrounding billionaires. She offered no wave, no manufactured humble smile. She simply moved with the terrifying certainty of a woman who had meticulously engineered this exact moment for years. As she reached the polished floor of the main stage, the master of ceremonies stepped respectfully aside, offering a deep deferential nod before vanishing completely into the dark wings. Aaliyah stepped confidently up to the glowing crystal podium. She placed both of her hands firmly on the smooth edges, letting the blinding heat of the twin spotlights wash over her. She slowly lowered her gaze, her piercing eyes cutting straight through the blinding glare to lock directly onto the front row. They're pressed desperately against the thick crimson velvet security rope were Marcus and Vivian Pierce. Vivian was still slumped on the marble floor, hyperventilating violently, her chest heaving as she stared up at her youngest daughter in absolute paralyzing horror. Marcus stood rigidly above his wife, his face contorted into a hideous mask of disbelief and panic. He looked like a cornered animal realizing the trap had snapped shut. Aaliyah adjusted the slender silver microphone with absolute precision. The sharp amplified click echoed like a gunshot across the cavernous room. "Good evening." Aaliyah began, her voice smooth, perfectly modulated, and radiating lethal authority. 10 years ago, I sat in a freezing, cramped college dormitory room, staring at a negative bank account balance and a mountain of unpaid tuition bills. I had absolutely no safety net. I had no wealthy benefactors, quietly writing massive checks to secure my future. I was completely intentionally cut off by the very people who were supposed to protect me. She paused, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch across the captivated audience. Many of you in this room tonight inherited your vast empires. You were born on third base and spent your entire lives violently demanding praise for hitting a triple. You believe that elite status is a birthright, and you viciously gatekeep your wealth to maintain that fragile illusion of superiority. Aaliyah leaned slightly forward, her gaze intensifying as she stared directly into her father's bloodshot eyes. But some people believe success is inherited. I believe it is forged in the absolute blistering fire of betrayal. I learned very early that true resilience is not simply about surviving a toxic environment. It is about actively cutting the rot completely out of your life, cauterizing the deep wound and utilizing that intense pain as the primary fuel to build an entirely new kingdom from scratch. The elite crowd remained absolutely spellbound, hanging on to every single heavily weighted syllable she delivered. Marcus gripped the velvet rope so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white, his jaw trembling violently with suppressed impotent rage. Aaliyah did not break eye contact with him, as she smoothly extended her right index finger and firmly pressed a small concealed silver button located on the side of the crystal podium. Instantly, the massive, three-story high-definition LED screens dominating the entire back wall of the grand stage flared to brilliant life. The wealthy audience instinctively leaned forward, fully expecting to see the proprietary algorithmic metrics, the staggering quarterly revenue reports, or the aggressive global expansion projections of Nexus AI. Instead, the giant digital displays illuminated the dark ballroom with something entirely different. Displayed in massive, inescapable black text against a stark white background were the official unredacted federal indictments and the comprehensive finalized Chapter 7 bankruptcy filings of Pierce Wealth Management. Every single damning detail was meticulously projected for all of Atlanta's most powerful elite to read clearly. The screens detailed the $50 million in toxic, deeply hidden debt, They openly displayed the multiple counts of severe federal wire fraud, the aggressive corporate embezzlement schemes, and the ruthless exploitation of vulnerable elderly clients. There were heavily verified digital signatures, detailed IP spoofing logs, and the explicit forfeiture of every single personal asset Marcus and Vivian had ever claimed to own. A collective gasp violently ripped through the sprawling ballroom. The shocking sound was followed instantly by a frantic, chaotic wave of aggressive whispering as thousands of influential venture capitalists and powerful tech billionaires frantically read the massive federal documents displayed prominently above. The meticulously crafted, completely fake facade of the previously powerful Pierce family was being brutally and publicly executed in real time, instantly broadcast in glorious high definition to the exact people Marcus had desperately tried to impress. The sheer, overwhelming humiliation finally shattered the last remaining fragment of Marcus's sanity. He violently shoved a state senator out of his way, lunging aggressively against the thick velvet security rope. "You absolute demon!" Marcus shouted frantically from the floor, his hoarse, desperate voice completely devoid of any previous authority. He pointed a violently shaking right finger directly up at the brightly illuminated stage, aggressively spitting as he screamed loudly. "You are deliberately destroying your own blood right in front of the entire world. You are a monster." Alia did not flinch at the pathetic, aggressive outburst. She simply smiled. It was a cold, calculated, and deeply terrifying smile that sent a visible shiver down the collective spine of the front row. She leaned intimately into the silver microphone, ensuring her final words echoed with absolute crystal-clear perfection across the massive, stunned audience. "I am absolutely not destroying anything, Marcus," Aaliyah replied smoothly, her powerful voice cutting effortlessly through his frantic screaming. "I am just giving the financial world a completely transparent, highly accurate quarterly report regarding a heavily fraudulent institution. And speaking of complete transparency, the federal authorities are currently waiting for you and Vivian at the coat check." Right on cue. The massive double doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom swung open with a heavy, terrifying thud. 6 towering United States Marshals strode purposefully into the brilliantly illuminated space. They wore dark, tactical vests over their crisp uniforms, their faces carved from absolute stone. The deafening silence that had gripped the elite crowd suddenly fractured into a symphony of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. As the heavily armed federal agents marched resolutely down the center aisle, the dense sea of tech billionaires, influential politicians, and ruthless venture capitalists immediately parted exactly like the Red Sea. No one wanted to be anywhere near the blast radius of the collapsing Pierce empire. The wealthy guests stepped rapidly backward, physically pulling their expensive custom silk gowns and tailored velvet tuxedos away from the ruined couple. The collective look of sheer disgust on the faces of the highest society was absolute and unforgiving. Marcus and Vivian were instantly isolated, stranded on a tiny, rapidly shrinking island of polished marble floor, completely surrounded by the suffocating judgment of the exact people they had desperately worshipped their entire miserable lives. The crushing reality of their total social annihilation was finally complete. Marcus frantically darted his bloodshot eyes around the massive room, his chest heaving as he desperately searched for a miraculous escape route that simply did not exist. He aggressively shoved a passing waiter, sending a silver tray of imported champagne crashing violently onto the floor, and lunged wildly toward the side emergency exit. He did not even make it 3 steps. The lead marshal lunged forward with terrifying speed, forcefully grabbing the collar of his cheap thrift store suit. The federal agent violently spun the disgraced patriarch around and slammed him face first against a high-top crystal cocktail table. The delicate glass surface shuddered under his heavy weight. Marcus let out a pathetic, breathless grunt as the agent forcefully wrenched both of his arms painfully behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed crisply across the silent ballroom. Seeing her dominant, previously untouchable husband brutally subdued in front of the entire city, Elite finally broke. Vivian completely. She fell hard onto her knees, screaming hysterically. Her cheap drugstore mascara immediately liquefied, running in dark, ugly streaks down her pale, sunken cheeks, aggressively staining the collar of her faded gray sweater. She reached her shaking, desperate hands out toward the brightly lit stage. She wailed aloud, begging and pleading for her youngest daughter to intervene, to deploy her massive wealth and save her mother from this unimaginable public humiliation. She begged again loudly, but absolutely nobody answered her cries tonight. While the federal agents expertly secured Marcus and Vivian, a sudden commotion erupted near the lavish seafood buffet on the far side of the opulent ballroom. Jasmine, who had secretly slipped into the exclusive gala using a forged press pass, was desperately trying to crawl unnoticed behind a massive, towering ice sculpture of a swan. She had witnessed the entire brutal takedown of her parents from the shadows and was frantically attempting to reach the rear service kitchen. Two female federal agents immediately spotted her pathetic retreat. They sprinted across the polished marble, expertly flanking the terrified woman. Jasmine shrieked loudly, wildly, knocking over a towering display of fresh oysters and expensive caviar as the agents grabbed her aggressively by her thin shoulders. They hauled her forcefully to her feet, entirely ignoring her frantic, nonsensical babbling about being a completely innocent victim of her husband's massive financial crimes. The heavy steel cuffs snapped shut around her wrists, exactly mirroring the terrible fate of her ruined parents. The elite crowd watched the simultaneous arrests, with a mixture of morbid fascination and absolute revulsion. The Pierce family, once the arrogant, untouchable golden rulers of high society, was currently being actively treated like common street criminals in the absolute center of the most exclusive corporate event of the entire decade. They had truly lost absolutely everything. Their fake empire was completely dismantled and totally obliterated before their very own eyes. The wealthy attendees simply stared blankly at the ultimate destruction happening right now. The lead marshal forcefully yanked Marcus upright, completely ignoring his pathetic groans of physical pain. The imposing agent aggressively marched the disgraced former billionaire directly past the front edge of the brilliantly illuminated main stage, heading toward the side service doors, where a secure federal transport vehicle was currently idling in the freezing rain. The massive crowd watched his utter destruction with unblinking eyes, silently memorizing every single detail of his horrific downfall. As Marcus stumbled clumsily past the glowing crystal podium, he violently twisted his neck, glaring furiously up at the flawless, untouched woman standing triumphantly above him. His face was a terrifying, deeply ugly mask of raw, unfiltered hatred. "You completely destroyed the entire Pierce legacy," Marcus screamed frantically, spitting venomous saliva onto the pristine, polished marble floor. His hoarse, desperate voice cracked violently under the crushing defeat. "You maliciously erased our entire family history forever. You are nothing but a disgusting traitor to your own blood." Aaliyah stood perfectly still, her breathtaking red silk gown glowing fiercely under the heavy stage lights. She slowly looked down at the pathetic, ruined man who had relentlessly tormented her for decades. Her beautiful expression was completely devoid of any anger, sadness, or pity. It was simply the cold, calculating look of a ruthless apex predator observing its dying prey. Aaliyah leaned slightly into the silver microphone, ensuring every single syllable resonated with absolute terrifying clarity across the entirely silent, utterly captivated ballroom. "No, Marcus," Aaliyah stated smoothly, her powerful voice slicing cleanly through his frantic screaming. "I am the legacy. You are just a filthy, toxic stain that finally got washed out." She gracefully picked up a flawless crystal flute of vintage champagne. Aaliyah raised the glass high, offering a cold toast as they were dragged screaming into the night. Exactly 365 days after that flawless crystal flute of vintage champagne was raised in the grand ballroom, Aaliyah sat in absolute silence inside her massive sunlit corner office. The executive suite of Nexus Artificial Intelligence headquarters was located on the 80th floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. The sprawling space was a stunning masterclass in minimalist power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, unobstructed view of the massive metropolis below. She sat behind a sleek, custom-milled obsidian desk, her fingers flying effortlessly across a holographic projection keyboard. The ambient temperature was perfectly regulated. Everything about her current environment projected absolute control, untouchable serenity, and undeniable victory. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic, deeply fraudulent, and utterly desperate world her family had violently dragged her through for decades. On the far wall of her immaculate office, a massive flat-screen television played quietly on a highly respected national financial news network. The volume was kept intentionally low, but the bold, bright red breaking news ticker scrolling aggressively across the bottom of the screen demanded immediate attention. The anchor, a severe-looking woman in a sharp navy blazer, looked directly into the camera with a grave expression. Aaliyah paused her rapid typing for a brief moment, leaning back into her ergonomic leather chair to watch the final pathetic chapter of the Pierce family legacy conclude in real time. The news network displayed a harsh, unforgiving split screen. On the left side was a live high-definition feed from the front steps of the downtown federal courthouse. A massive swarm of aggressive journalists and flashing camera lenses crowded around the heavy bronze doors. On the right side, the network broadcast highly detailed, unflattering courtroom sketches from inside the deeply tense sentencing hearing. The anchor's crisp voice cut clearly through the quiet office space. She detailed the absolute total collapse of Pierce Wealth Management and the staggering, unprecedented severity of the federal verdicts just handed down by the presiding district judge. Marcus Pierce, the once terrifying, supposedly invincible patriarch of high society, was officially sentenced to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The courtroom sketch artist captured his deeply sunken, graying face perfectly. He looked completely hollowed out, stripped of his expensive tailored suits, and forced into a bright orange, poorly fitting prison jumpsuit. The anchor noted that Marcus remained aggressively unrepentant until the very end, loudly interrupting the judge to blame market fluctuations instead of his own massive, heavily documented embezzlement schemes. He would be well into his late 80s before he even had a tiny chance at a parole hearing. He was destined to die alone, rotting in a tiny concrete cell, entirely forgotten by the elite billionaires he had desperately worshipped. Jasmine and Bradley fared absolutely no better. The anchor described how the deeply toxic, highly volatile couple had violently turned against each other during the exhaustive 6-month trial. They aggressively weaponized their highly publicized divorce proceedings, desperately attempting to trade damning digital evidence to secure lighter sentences. The federal judge, entirely disgusted by their mutual greed and complete lack of human empathy, struck them both with the maximum penalty: 10 consecutive years each. The news displayed a brief, chaotic video clip of Jasmine being forcefully dragged out of the courtroom by two armed bailiffs. She was screaming frantically, her hair a wild, unkempt mess, entirely unrecognizable from the polished, arrogant golden child who used to effortlessly command the country club. Bradley simply kept his head down, sobbing pathetically into his shackled hands as the heavy wooden gavel fell loudly. Vivian, however, had chosen an incredibly cowardly path. Terrified of spending a single night in a federal jail cell, she ruthlessly cut a sweeping plea deal with the aggressive federal prosecutors. She eagerly turned state witness, aggressively testifying against her own husband and her favorite daughter to save her own skin. In exchange for her complete betrayal, Vivian avoided a prison cell, but her punishment was a uniquely tailored, deeply humiliating hell. She was sentenced to 10 strict years of house arrest, completely confined to a tiny, dilapidated state-funded apartment located in the absolute worst neighborhood in the city. Furthermore, she was mandated to perform 2,000 hours of crippling, highly public community service. The news network flashed a depressing photograph taken earlier that week by a ruthless tabloid photographer. It showed Vivian wearing a cheap, stained yellow reflective vest, kneeling on wet concrete in the freezing rain. She was aggressively scrubbing graffiti off a public park bench, her once pristine, heavily manicured hands wrapped in cheap rubber gloves. She had traded her entire family for a miserable, completely isolated existence. A gentle, melodic chime interrupted the broadcast. The frosted glass doors of the executive office slid open silently. Aaliyah's highly efficient personal assistant stepped smoothly into the sunlit room. He carried a small, neat stack of heavily stamped cheap manila envelopes. He walked purposefully toward the obsidian desk, his expression entirely neutral. "Excuse the interruption, ma'am," the assistant said respectfully, placing the letters precisely on the edge of the desk. The Daily Mail sorting algorithm flagged these specific items. They are all officially postmarked from the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. I reviewed the sender logs. They are direct, highly desperate letters from your father and your sister. The internal screening team noted they are aggressively begging for you to deposit money into their prison commissary accounts. They claim they cannot afford basic hygiene supplies or warm blankets. Alia did not even blink. She did not reach out to touch the cheap, coarse paper. She simply stared at the pathetic stack of envelopes with the same cold, calculating indifference she used to analyze obsolete lines of computer code. She slowly reached across her desk and picked up the entire stack of letters in one smooth motion. She did not open a single one. She did not read a single desperate, manipulative word. Beside her desk sat a massive, high-grade industrial document shredder designed to instantly obliterate highly classified corporate secrets. Aaliyah held the letters over the feeding slot. She released her grip. The heavy machine roared aggressively to life, its titanium teeth instantly shredding the thick envelopes into thousands of microscopic, completely unreadable paper fragments. The aggressive grinding noise of the machine entirely destroyed the absolute last remaining ties to her deeply toxic family. "No handouts," Alia stated firmly, her powerful voice perfectly echoing the exact cruel text message her father had sent her on her college graduation day. She turned away from the shredder and looked directly at her assistant. "Clear my entire afternoon schedule immediately. Do not accept any calls from the board of directors. I have a graduation to attend." The elevator doors glided shut, sealing Aaliyah inside a silent capsule of polished steel and warm ambient light as she descended 80 floors to the bustling Atlanta streets below. Looking at her faint reflection in the metallic doors, she finally allowed a rare private exhalation to escape her chest. The utter destruction of the Pierce family empire was a necessary surgical extraction, but it was never her ultimate endgame. She had not spent the last decade working grueling 100-hour weeks simply to build a massive financial weapon for revenge. She had built a fortress, a highly secure, impenetrable haven designed explicitly to ensure no one could ever exercise financial control over her life again. Now that the toxic rot of her past was permanently eradicated, she was finally ready to deploy the true purpose of her vast corporate wealth. Her sleek black executive car was waiting at the curb. She slid into the plush leather back seat and instructed her driver to head toward the historic University District. Today marked the highly confidential, unpublicized launch of her massive philanthropic endeavor. She called it the New Flame Foundation. The board of directors at Nexus Artificial Intelligence had strongly advised her to create a highly visible, heavily branded corporate charity focused on coding camps for elementary students to secure favorable tax write-offs and positive public relations. Aaliyah had immediately overruled them all. She did not care about corporate optics or generating shallow press releases. The New Flame Foundation operated with a razor-sharp, highly specific mandate, completely independent of her tech conglomerate. The foundation was designed to provide massive, unrestricted, no-strings-attached seed funding and comprehensive full-ride academic scholarships exclusively to young Black women who had been maliciously disowned, financially abused, or ruthlessly cut off by their own toxic families. Alia knew firsthand the paralyzing terror of having basic survival resources weaponized by the people supposed to provide unconditional love. She knew exactly how it felt to have college tuition dangled like a behavioral leash, only to have it violently yanked away as a form of psychological punishment. The New Flame Foundation completely removed that financial leverage. Her rigorous application process did not require glowing letters of recommendation from well-connected family friends or pristine credit scores. It required raw honesty, undeniable ambition, and the sheer will to survive. She was actively hunting for the scapegoats, the black sheep, and the deeply misunderstood daughters who were desperately trying to build a viable future while standing in the smoldering ashes of their burned-down family dynamics. She was actively writing massive, irrevocable checks to ensure these brilliant young women never had to beg toxic parents for a single dime ever again. Her driver smoothly navigated the heavy afternoon traffic, eventually pulling up to the towering wrought iron gates of a prestigious local university. Aaliyah stepped out of the vehicle, pulling the lapels of her sharp-tailored blazer against the crisp autumn breeze. The sprawling, beautifully manicured campus was absolutely chaotic. It was officially graduation day. The massive central quad was flooded with a vibrant, deafening sea of celebratory joy. Proud parents were loudly cheering, hoisting massive bouquets of bright flowers and colorful mylar balloons high into the air. Massive extended families were aggressively crowding together on the pristine green lawns, completely blocking the brick walkways to capture the perfect smiling photographs with their newly minted graduates. Alia walked slowly along the perimeter of the frantic celebration, her dark sunglasses shielding her observant eyes from the bright afternoon sun. The overwhelming sounds of unconditional parental pride washed over her in massive waves. 10 years ago, witnessing this exact scene would have completely shattered her fragile composure. It would have triggered a severe hyperventilating panic attack rooted deep in her profound childhood trauma. She vividly remembered standing entirely alone outside her own college auditorium, clutching her computer science degree with trembling hands while staring at a violently cruel text message from her father. Today, however, her heart rate remained perfectly steady. The crisp air entering her lungs felt incredibly light and clean. She watched a father proudly lift his cheering daughter off the ground in a massive hug. Aaliyah felt a brief, distant echo of her own painful past, but the memory felt entirely hollow now. It held absolutely no psychological power over her anymore. The heavy, suffocating ghost of Marcus Pierce had been completely exorcised from her mind. She had successfully metabolized her intense trauma into unstoppable, world-altering power. She was finally completely free. Seeking a brief moment of quiet away from the deafening brass band, currently marching directly across the main lawn, Aaliyah turned down a narrow, heavily shaded brick pathway lined with ancient towering oak trees. The loud cheering and celebratory music quickly faded into a dull, distant hum. The air here was much cooler, completely untouched by the frantic energy of the graduating crowds. As she rounded a gentle curve in the winding path, her sharp eyes immediately caught a flash of dark fabric. Sitting entirely alone on a weathered stone bench, completely isolated from the massive celebrations happening just 50 yards away, was a young black woman. She was wearing a traditional black graduation gown, the heavy fabric pooling awkwardly around her ankles. A bright gold honor cord was draped unevenly around her neck, a silent testament to years of grueling academic excellence. But there were no proud parents standing beside her holding flowers. There were no siblings cheering her name. The young woman was hunched forward, her shoulders shaking violently with suppressed, silent sobs. She was aggressively wiping hot tears from her cheeks with the back of her trembling hand. Her face was brightly illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving glare of her smartphone screen. Aaliyah stopped walking instantly. She recognized that exact devastating posture of absolute heartbreak. She knew exactly what it looked like when a day meant for spectacular triumph was violently poisoned by a targeted digital rejection from a toxic parent. Aaliyah slowly took off her dark sunglasses, her sharp eyes locking onto the weeping graduate as she took a deliberate, purposeful step forward. The dry autumn leaves crunched sharply under Aaliyah's expensive leather heels as she closed the short distance between them. The sudden crisp sound startled the young woman. She quickly snapped her head up, her terrified eyes wide and bloodshot. She frantically swiped the back of her trembling hand across her wet cheeks, desperately attempting to mask her raw vulnerability from a complete stranger. She quickly pressed the power button on her smartphone, plunging the harsh, cruel text message back into digital darkness. Aaliyah did not hesitate or wait for a formal invitation. She simply moved the heavy folds of her designer blazer and sat down gracefully on the opposite end of the weathered stone bench. A heavy, pregnant silence hung between them for a long moment, broken only by the distant, joyful cheers echoing from the main university quadrangle. Aaliyah looked straight ahead at the ancient oak trees, purposefully giving the young graduate a necessary moment to collect her shattered breathing. It is a uniquely devastating feeling, Aaliyah stated smoothly, her calm voice slicing cleanly through the cold afternoon breeze. To sit on the exact precipice of your greatest personal achievement and feel entirely hollowed out by the very people who were supposed to be cheering the loudest. The young woman stiffened her tense shoulders, rising defensively beneath the heavy black fabric of her graduation gown. She clutched her glowing smartphone tightly against her chest, like a fragile physical shield. I am perfectly fine, the girl lied, her voice cracking violently on the second syllable. My family simply ran into a minor scheduling conflict today. It is really not a big deal at all. Alia slowly turned her head, her piercing gaze locking directly onto the young woman's terrified, defensive eyes. Aaliyah offered no hollow pity, no manufactured sympathy, and no useless platitudes. She simply offered undeniable, absolute recognition. You do not have to lie to me, Aaliyah said softly, her tone carrying the heavy metallic weight of shared trauma. I know exactly what a scheduling conflict actually means. It means they decided to punish you. It means they decided to weaponize their absence to actively destroy your triumph. The young woman's defensive walls instantly collapsed. A fresh, heavy wave of hot tears spilled over her dark eyelashes, tracking rapidly down her cheeks. She let out a ragged, agonizing sob, finally surrendering to the crushing weight of her absolute heartbreak. They wanted me to take over their failing beauty supply business. The girl confessed, her voice a desperate, frantic whisper. My parents own 3 tiny retail stores in a dying strip mall. They demanded I drop out of my senior year to manage their inventory and fix their massive debt. When I firmly refused when I told them I was going to finish my rigorous degree in software engineering, they completely lost their minds. They called me an arrogant, ungrateful traitor. They officially disowned me exactly 1 hour before the graduation ceremony began. They completely drained my tiny emergency savings account this morning and aggressively told me to never contact them ever again. Alia listened intently, absorbing every single agonizing detail without interrupting. She felt the familiar burning phantom pain of her own past, but she quickly channeled that raw energy into immediate calculated action. She smoothly reached her right hand inside the interior breast pocket of her tailored blazer. She withdrew a thick, heavy envelope crafted from premium black cardstock. The front of the crisp envelope was elegantly stamped with the bright, glowing gold foil crest of the newly established New Flame Foundation. Aaliyah held the heavy envelope out, suspending it perfectly in the small space between them. I know exactly what that devastating text message says, Aaliyah said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, unbreakable iron. And I know exactly how much it violently hurts to read those cruel words. I know the paralyzing terror of suddenly realizing you are completely alone in the world with absolutely zero financial safety net. The young woman stared blankly at the gold-embossed envelope, her trembling fingers hesitating. She slowly reached out and took the heavy cardstock. She carefully slid her thumb under the pristine wax seal, breaking it open with a sharp, satisfying snap. She pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents printed on heavy watermarked corporate paper. As her tear-filled eyes aggressively scanned the bold black text, her jaw dropped in absolute paralyzing shock. The official document was a completely unrestricted, fully executed contract for an elite fellowship directly inside the highly exclusive Nexus Artificial Intelligence Incubator program. It guaranteed her immediate, unlimited access to the most advanced proprietary server farms on the entire planet. It explicitly provided elite one-on-one executive mentorship. But the most shocking detail was printed aggressively in bold ink at the very bottom of the primary page. It was a formal, legally binding authorization for an immediate tax-free direct deposit of a $100,000 living stipend, completely free of any corporate equity demands or hidden contractual strings. The young graduate violently gasped for air, her wide eyes darting frantically from the staggering financial numbers printed on the paper directly to the calm, beautiful face of the woman sitting beside her. The harsh afternoon sunlight finally illuminated Alia's striking features perfectly. Recognition hit the young girl like a massive physical shockwave. She instantly realized she was sitting right next to the most powerful, intensely ruthless tech billionaire on the entire eastern seaboard. "You are Alia Pierce," the girl whispered frantically. Her hands shaking so violently, the heavy corporate papers rattled loudly in the quiet air. "You are the sole founder of Nexus. This document is a complete full-ride fellowship. This is a massive fortune. I do not understand any of this at all. Why in the world are you doing this for a complete random stranger you just met on a park bench?" Alia did not break eye contact. She let a genuinely warm, deeply powerful smile slowly form on her lips. It was a smile completely devoid of the icy, calculated ruthlessness she strictly reserved for the cutthroat corporate boardroom. It was a smile of pure, absolute liberation. "Because family is absolutely not the people who biologically create you," Aaliyah answered, her powerful voice ringing with absolute, undeniable truth. "Family are the people who actively choose to stay and help you build your kingdom when you have absolutely nothing left." Alia did not wait for profound gratitude or endless tearful thank you speeches. She gracefully stood up from the weathered stone bench, effortlessly smoothing the crisp fabric of her tailored blazer. She turned her back and began walking purposefully down the shaded brick pathway, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the solid ground. She left the young, brilliant software engineer sitting alone under the ancient oak trees, clutching her new golden future against her chest, crying heavy, beautiful tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Aaliyah walked straight toward her black car, fully ready to aggressively dismantle the toxic empires of the past and ruthlessly fund the brilliant, untouchable queens of the future. The heavy door of the black sedan closed with a solid thud, sealing Aaliyah inside the luxurious interior. Her driver smoothly merged onto the sunlit campus perimeter road, navigating away from the chaotic graduation crowds toward the highly secure aviation zone located on the southern edge of the university. Aaliyah leaned her head back against the pristine leather headrest, letting the quiet hum of the powerful engine soothe her mind. She watched the historic brick buildings and sprawling green lawns glide past the tinted windows. The emotional weight of the afternoon was rapidly dissipating, replaced by a surge of pure electric momentum. Her private car bypassed the standard security checkpoints, rolling smoothly onto the freshly paved tarmac of the university helipad. Sitting perfectly in the center of the landing pad was her custom matte black Nexus helicopter. The massive, aerodynamic machine looked like a predatory bird resting in the afternoon sun. The twin turbine engines were already whining with a low intensity, and the massive main rotors were slowly beginning to spin, slicing through the crisp autumn air. Her highly trained aviation team stood at strict attention near the boarding ramp, dressed in sharp black uniforms, bearing the glowing silver logo. Aaliyah stepped out of the vehicle, the sudden rush of wind from the accelerating rotors whipping the hem of her blazer. She did not rush. She walked across the tarmac with the measured grace of a woman who completely owned the ground she walked upon. Before stepping onto the metal boarding ramp, Aaliyah paused and turned her body around. She looked back at the sprawling university skyline one final time. The towering library spires pierced the bright blue sky, casting long shadows across the campus. 10 years ago, she walked away from this exact location, feeling completely broken, financially destitute, and deeply terrified of the unknown future. She had been a traumatized scapegoat, violently cast out by a toxic family, demanding absolute submission. Now she was looking at the exact same landscape through the eyes of an untouchable conqueror. She had not simply survived their relentless psychological warfare. She had completely obliterated their fraudulent empire and used the heavy rubble to construct an impenetrable fortress of her own. She had surgically severed every single disease-toxic root anchoring her to the Pierce family legacy. In their place, she had single-handedly planted a massive, thriving forest of undeniable technological power and profound philanthropic reach. The new Flame Foundation would ensure thousands of brilliant young women would never have to endure the agonizing financial abuse she had suffered. She was no longer the tragic victim of Marcus and Vivian Pierce. She was the sole uncontested architect of her own spectacular destiny. The profound realization settled deep into her bones, bringing a profound sense of absolute peace she had never experienced before. The ghosts of her past were officially dead, permanently buried under the massive, undeniable weight of her colossal success. As she stood there absorbing the flawless victory, a sharp vibration buzzed against her ribs. Aaliyah reached into the pocket of her blazer and pulled out her heavily encrypted smartphone. The bright high-resolution screen illuminated, instantly cutting through the growing shadows of the late afternoon. It was an urgent, high-priority text message directly from her chief financial officer. The message was incredibly brief, but it carried the raw, world-altering weight of a massive seismic shift in the global financial markets. Aaliyah scanned the crisp, black text scrolling across her screen. The CFO reported that the highly anticipated third-quarter revenue numbers had just been fully finalized and officially verified by their independent auditing firm. Nexus Artificial Intelligence had completely shattered yet another historic financial record, massively exceeding even their most aggressive, optimistic internal projections. Wall Street analysts were already entering a state of absolute, unprecedented frenzy. Because of the staggering new revenue data, the massive tech conglomerate was no longer simply a unicorn. Nexus Artificial Intelligence was now officially designated as a decacorn, boasting a staggering, unassailable private market valuation of exactly $10 billion. Aaliyah stared at the massive number glowing brightly on her screen. $10 billion. It was an amount of immense, concentrated power that Marcus Pierce could not have even hallucinated in his wildest, most arrogant dreams. He had sacrificed his entire family to maintain a pathetic illusion of wealth, while she had built an actual empire of absolute truth. Aaliyah did not let out a loud cheer or pump her fist in the air. She simply allowed a slow, deeply satisfied smile to curve her lips. Her fingers flew rapidly across the digital keyboard, typing a swift, effortlessly confident response to her frantic chief financial officer. She simply typed, "No worries. We are just barely getting started." She firmly locked the screen and slid the encrypted phone back into her pocket. The deafening roar of the helicopter engines reached their maximum takeoff RPM, drowning out the distant, fading sounds of the university graduation ceremonies. Aaliyah turned her back on the campus forever and stepped confidently onto the metal ramp. She climbed into the luxurious, leather-lined cabin of the helicopter. Her lead pilot offered a sharp, respectful salute before sealing the heavy, soundproof cabin doors shut. The sudden silence inside the aircraft was absolute and completely profound. Aaliyah sank deeply into the plush leather captain's seat, securely fastening her harness. The massive machine lifted smoothly and aggressively off the tarmac, banking sharply toward the glowing western horizon. As the helicopter soared high above the sprawling, glittering skyline of Atlanta, the dying sun painted the clouds in spectacular shades of brilliant gold and deep crimson. Aaliyah leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. She took a slow, incredibly deep breath, filling her lungs with the crisp, conditioned air. She was breathing in the sweet, intoxicating scent of absolute, untouchable freedom. The world below her rapidly faded away, leaving only the limitless golden sky ahead. The story of Aaliyah Pierce teaches us a profound and empowering truth. Blood does not automatically dictate family, and you are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic relatives warm. For generations, society has pushed the damaging narrative that we must endlessly forgive and endure familial abuse simply because of a shared bloodline. Aaliyah's journey completely shatters this toxic myth. It proves that true family consists of the people who actively support your growth and protect your peace, not those who ruthlessly scheme for your downfall or weaponize their love conditionally to control you. Furthermore, the narrative demonstrates that the most devastating form of revenge is never found in chaotic screaming matches or stooping to an abuser's pathetic level. It is found in absolute, undeniable success. Aaliyah didn't just survive her family's betrayal. She actively weaponized her intense pain, transforming it into the exact fuel she needed to construct an untouchable billion-dollar empire. She maintained her icy composure, meticulously gathered her undeniable evidence, and allowed her monumental achievements and the federal law to deliver the final fatal blow. She reclaimed her entire life narrative through silence, calculated strategy, and unshakable personal boundaries. Lastly, true triumph is not merely about financially or socially destroying those who maliciously hurt you, it is about ensuring others never have to suffer that same agonizing fate. By establishing the New Flame Foundation, Aaliyah successfully broke the generational curse. She utilized her ultimate power to build sturdy ladders for other abused, marginalized women, rather than just building higher walls for herself. The ultimate lesson is clear. Your trauma absolutely does not define you, but how you choose to rise from its smoldering ashes can genuinely change the world. Drop a comment below if you have ever had to boldly cut toxic ties to protect your peace, and hit that subscribe button for more fierce, unapologetic stories of women taking back their power.